and you were on a level of stress all the time, of anticipation of combat. Now, all of that gradually sucked it out of you, and after a few months, not long, after a few months, you're physically and mentally started to deteriorate. And that was when you got killed, because that was when you switched off. Track quite easily. But he wouldn't go on, and he came back, and I urged him forward, and he refused to go any further past this T-junction, and he sat on my foot. And this is something that he'd never done before. And I knew something was wrong, but as I urged him to move forward a few more paces, the first explosion went off, and it occurred on my right-hand side. And the Australians, moving up both sides of the bush either side of me, trod on an M16 mine. The platoon commander trod on an M16 mine, and it blew up. And it blew him up, took his legs off, injured his signaller, and 2 or 3 others that were close by. Well, when the explosion went off, it picked me up and it threw me forward. And I felt as if I'd been hit in the back. And I felt all this water, this hot liquid just squirting down my legs, so I thought I was just bleeding from the back. But actually, I pissed myself with a shock.
How was Caesar?
Well, he just turned around and sort of looked at me like, look what you've brought us into this time. He didn't react to the explosion. He detected that bomb. There's no question about it. And he stopped me going forward any further. He knew something was bad there, and it probably smelled of enemy.
Great. So, Peter, in your own time, if you could give us that brief, condensed history of your life.
Yeah, well, my childhood was spent in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. That's where I grew up as a child. And my father was a builder there. That's where I first went to school. And that's basically, my memories of childhood are basically all centred around Central Africa, which is now Zimbabwe.
When did you first hear of Vietnam?
It actually came at the end of infantry training, when I went and I was attached to the dog training unit. That was when we started to find the skew was towards Asian or jungle type warfare.
When did you know you were going off to do the dog handling?
Well,
take us to there.
the dog side of things, right? The tracking wing, which is what it was called, at the infantry training centre, we had a reinforcement wing, which soldiers who had completed their infantry training and were not posted to a battalion went to a reinforcement wing. And they flew overseas as individuals to top up the battalions. Pardon me, the battle wing was the training wing, which I was part of. The battle wing were all the platoons and all the recruits that were learning to be infantrymen. Then there was an administration wing which ran all the paperwork for everything. And one of the new wings was called the tracking wing. Now the trackers actually lived in 2 of the wooden huts that we were in, but they were a little bit of a distance away from us. So I never actually communicated with them. I had no idea what it was about, but if you look down through the trees from where we were, about 500 metres away was a block of dog kennels. So basically, they were training the dogs and pairing them up with young soldiers, and then posting them to the infantry battalions. The dogs were being grabbed from anywhere. They were coming from dog homes. They were being picked up from the RSPCA, and some of them were being donated to the army. The only criteria was that the dog had to be a Labrador or a Labrador crossed, and it had to be black, and it had to be in good condition. It had to be fairly healthy. So there was a real gaggle of dogs down there, and they were a mixture. They were a real wild bunch. They were larrikins. Some of them were fighting all the time. Others were just docile labs, which were failed seeing eye dogs. Some of them were pulled out of off death row. Well, the one eventually I got was off death row, and they got him, and they cost about $3 or $4. And there was just a strange bunch of dogs, and because of the fact that they were so odd, they were good. They were really good. They there was a couple of failures, but basically, under the stewardship of Arthur Ether, who was the chief training instructor there, he put man on dog, and you worked with that dog. It was your dog, just like your rifle was your rifle. That was your dog. Slept in the kennel, but you slept in the hut. And you fed him, you slept with him in the bush, you worked with him, you taught the dog obedience, and you taught the dog to gradually track. And for the dog to qualify, you had to do 5 to 10 kilometres, follow a human scent for 5 to 10 kilometres through bush. And point at the enemy, the person you were following, so you didn't run into him. And the dog had to know all basic obedience. That was basically staying, sitting, and going down. So he did everything that you told him to do. Once that bonding had taken place and the dog was qualified, you were then going to be posted to a battalion. So I ended up down there washing out kennels, waiting for a dog. And we were our own little community. We were left alone, nobody came near us. Every week we'd go out for 2 or 3 days down to the bulleye or into the scrub, and we'd stay out there for 3 days and we'd lay tracks and teach the dogs to track with a handler coupled up.
Well, the dog's ever trained to be familiar with the sounds of war, the loud bangs and things associated with...
Part of the training, as well as the tracking, was they'd be taken to the rifle range and they would sit around the rifle range for a couple of hours. If the dog was gun shy and went berserk or anything, he was failed. But most dogs just sat there and ignored the bangs. We used to harden them up by walking them along bitumen roads, so we hardened their pads and toes up. And also we went through obstacle courses, so we crawled under wire, went over fences, and ran across moats and that sort of thing. So the dog actually became familiar with the combat experience. But he was non-aggressive. And the only thing that he had to do was indicate enemy by smell, by getting a smell pattern towards him, and lift his head and point 50 to 100 metres before you got to the enemy. That was the absolute criteria that was the end criteria for passing. The dog had to be able to point, because if he didn't, you'd walk into them. What happened was the champion tracking dog in the wing, called Caesar, a Labrador Kelpie cross, had been teed up with a handler, but the handler had decided he wanted to go to Vietnam as a digger and didn't want to go as a dog handler, so he got posted to the reinforcement wing. Didn't have a dog, so Lieutenant French said, "You've got the top dog." And in June, less than 3 months away, you're going to be posted to the 2nd Battalion, and they're going to Vietnam. So I had to tee up with this dog, which was already fully trained, ready to go, and learn everything about this dog, and get myself to a combat readiness with a tracking dog to be posted to the 2nd Battalion in Queensland, which was going to go to Vietnam in June. Caesar was just, everything about him was odd. He had an odd-shaped head, he had kelpie ears, one hung down because it had a piece missing out of it, had long legs, big bushy tail, and this flat sort of head. But he was absolutely exceptional tracking dog. He could follow a human scent 72 hours after you'd gone through the bush in heavy rain. He pointed 50 to 100 metres away every time by lifting these ears up. I never missed his point. He didn't care much for obedience. He kept trying me out on obedience because he didn't want to be obedient. He had a larrikin side to him. And we got called out by the police on 2 occasions to track down missing people. And we found a little girl that had been abducted in Sydney. And Caesar actually followed her through suburban Ashfield, past a church with 100 people, straight through the middle, and we found the little girl had been locked in the toilet at a parade ground. And that dog then made the headlines in the newspapers. And for me, what it did was it showed me the incredible ability and talent that this particular tracking dog had. They all had that ability and talent, all those that were going to go overseas. They were all trained to that standard. But then we saw it actually being used. When I saw it being used in a practical way, I realised how good it was, and that this gift that animals have. So it wasn't long after that we were ready to go to Vietnam, and the posting date came due for us to go to the 2nd Battalion. We knew nothing about the 2nd Battalion, Dennis and I, and we were going to go in only about maybe 3 to 4 weeks before we were due to fly to Vietnam. So we were going to join that battalion and be there for a very short period of time in Brisbane, and then go to Vietnam. So the time came around, Dennis and I went home, and we had what was referred to as a week's pre-embarkation leave, which everybody was entitled to before they went to war, because I had turned 19 by this stage. And I came home, it was a bit of a blur, and nobody made much comment. They knew we were going to Vietnam, but I basically went around, saw my friends, saw some old girlfriends, and I'm going off for my big adventure, and it was sort of best of luck, you know, because Vietnam had not reached a stage where there were a lot of Australians dead other than the Long Tan battle. So it was still low profile in June 1967. We went to the airport, to Richmond, and we were loaded onto an aircraft. Both dogs were placed in portable kennels or packing cases, and we flew up to Brisbane. We landed, got the dogs off, and then drove down to the camp where the 2nd Battalion was at Inogra. Took the dogs out, got them put into temporary built kennels, and waited for all of the other 2nd Battalion, the 800 men, to come back to Inogra, and then we were ready to go to Vietnam. We were going to the country early with the dogs, because we had to acclimatise them to a tropical environment, the heat. So Dennis and I, once again, got on an RAAF aircraft, a Hercules, with the 2 dogs in their packing cases, and we flew out of Brisbane on our way to Vietnam.
Peter, you've been doing a fair bit of flying with these dogs. Had they needed any training for that?
Well, that's a rather interesting aspect. We weren't able to do a lot of flying in Australia with the dogs. We knew that these dogs were going to be involved in a fair amount of flying in Vietnam in helicopters, because the role of a tracking team was to actually be flown or transported in some way out to a contact site where the battle was. And our role was basically to be on standby. I say our role, that's myself and Caesar and Dennis and with his dog Marcus. We were going to be on standby to actually be flown out to where the fight was. And that could be from a fire support base in the jungle, or it could be from the main task force at Nui Dan. So we knew we were going to be put on helicopters and flown out to these sites any number of times. We didn't know how many times it was going to happen, if it happened at all, or whether it was going to be 100 times. We couldn't practice this in Australia, because the availability of helicopters in Australia to actually practice on was pretty difficult. We managed to fly once around Ingleburn Training Centre in an Iroquois helicopter with the doors closed as a familiarisation flight. And the other aspect was that if the helicopters couldn't land at the contact site in Vietnam, we were going to have to be lowered from the chopper down through the trees on a harness and a winch. And this was something we thought was very likely going to happen, and we had to sort of practice it. So in Australia, what we did was we constructed and invented our own winch jacket for dogs. And when a person's lowered out of a helicopter, they go out the side door. They have a loop around them, and they are basically lowered down by the door gunner, who presses a button, and he lowers you down on a steel cable, down through the trees to the ground. Could be 100 feet. With a dog, it hadn't been done before, so we constructed a jacket that would wrap around a dog and buckle and have a ring that would attach to a hook, and the dog could be pushed out of the chopper and lowered down as well. The only way we could actually practice this initially was by throwing a rope over a bough of a tree and jerking the dog up and down, see how high we could get him back up and down using this jacket. And they sort of found this a bit strange. We eventually tried it once in a helicopter, in Australia with one dog, and we found that we could lower the dog down. The dog found it quite comfortable going through the air and thought it was just a bit of a joke. So when we got to Vietnam, we were ready to go, and we were ready to get on a helicopter, close the doors, strap ourselves in and fly out. Helicopters in Vietnam did not work like that at all. They had no doors, they had no belts, and every one of them was flown by a pretty crazy jockey going at 100 mile an hour. And it was pretty wild. We found out the hard way. And we'd been in country in Vietnam for maybe a week or two, and the battalion had joined us. We were all together in our tents. We're in 4-man tents. And the dogs were quite happy in their kennel, and we were ready to go. We were ready to go into action to track down the Viet Cong and kill them, what we've been practicing in Australia. But there was a sort of an unreality about the fact that this was really going to happen. But when it did happen, it happened very, very quickly. An infantry platoon had a contact with an enemy. They killed a couple, and 3 or 4 others shot off through the bush. The battalion wasn't entirely au fait with how to use dogs. It was going to be a learning curve for them as well as us. And there's some reluctance on the part of some units to call for dogs, because they thought that the dogs were going to lead them straight into an ambush or a full-on contact. Other platoons felt they'd like to try it out because they wanted to get the enemy, which was what they were there for. And we were still at this stage, felt we were fighting a guerrilla war, where we were up against guerrillas with primitive weaponry, basically hit and run, lived like ferals, weren't well trained or well disciplined, and that was going to be the way it was. And they were the enemy, and we were to kill them. There wasn't any great problem with that. However, in reality, they weren't like that at all. They were highly trained, mobile, well armed, prepared to fight, had huge numbers, and they were also reinforced by the North Vietnamese army, which was an army, and had come down into South Vietnam to work with their brothers and comrades on kicking us all out. The North Vietnamese army were fully equipped, a fully trained army, the same as the Australian and the American army. So Vietnam, that we thought was going to be a guerrilla war, was not a guerrilla war. It was a full-on war. The only difference was it didn't have a front line or a back line or a side line. It was all around us. So 2 guys and 2 dogs found themselves in this sort of situation where we were going to track down the enemy, and it was going to be a fairly straightforward exercise. When in fact, we were going to be tracking down a well-equipped armed outfit that were determined to kill us as we were to kill them. So the first day came, and the platoon had a contact, and we were called for. And we had decided, or it had been decided for us, that the 2 dogs were not going to go out on one track. One dog was going to go out on the track with the coverman and the visual tracker and a combat unit, while the other one stayed back on call. When I came back, Marcus would go out on the next call out. When the next call out came, I'd go out. So we rotated. And that way, the battalion, the 2nd Battalion, was able to have access to 2 assets, 2 dogs working, if the need required, instead of just 2 dogs going out and being tied up in one operation. So I went out on the first call up, and the helicopter came down and landed. It was an Australian pilot, and had to get used to these Iroquois choppers very quickly. They had a big passenger bay. There was 1 seat, a bench seat, 2 pilots up the front, 2 door gunners at either side, and pretty well armed to the teeth. And there was you just piled in and you just dropped yourself on the floor. The doors were pinned back, the doors were continually open, there was no seatbelts or anything like that. It was really pretty wild and basic. And we were flown out to our first contact. The first contact was a bit odd for me, because suddenly we were on the ground and we were looking at dead people. And a couple of Viet Cong had been shot, and they were lying there, and the others had taken off into the bush. So that sort of made sense to me that this will work quite easily. This is exactly what the dog and the trackers are supposed to do. But I had to get used to the fact that suddenly these were dead people on the ground and we were going out to kill the others. And I was 19 and I was pretty naive, and I suddenly got really, really scared. And my mouth dried out, and I felt like I didn't want to do it. And I thought, we'll sit down and we'll have a talk about what we're going to do. No talking, we've got to get going. Chase now, chase now. So I hooked Caesar up, and suddenly my whole world was going to rely on this dog. I don't know what his concept of war was, and I don't know what his concept of tracking people down and killing them was, because everything had been an exercise and a game before. Now, it was a game, but it was deadly game, because those at the other end, if we found them, were going to try and zap us, and we were going to try and zap them if we didn't get them first. My cover man came up behind me, he said, ready to go. And I thought, shit, this is bloody suddenly starting. And I'm looking on the ground and there's blood everywhere. And the infantry platoon had fallen in behind us and they were going to follow us. This is what it was all about. You guys know what you're doing. Go and find the enemy. And I had a couple of drinks of water and I couldn't set myself down, and the Caesar's looking. And as soon as I hook on the clip on the ring to his harness, that means he knows it's got to work. That was the trigger for go. And I'd say seek or find. And he would put his head down, would look for some sort of sign like a boot print or something. It didn't need to, it was blood everywhere. Put his head down and away he went, and he trotted. First thing he did was he had a crap, then he had a wee, then he walked off there and had a smell. I'm thinking, just come on mate, get onto it. And he trots along, smelling, and he's following the track of the enemy, which was basically along a foot track. In Australia, most of our tracks had actually been through virgin bush, because Australians never walked on tracks. We always walked in the bush because tracks were mined and booby trapped. And so. But naturally, the enemy ran along tracks. I mean, that was the first thing that had to occur to us when we got to Vietnam. We're going to be tracking on tracks and trails, not through the bush. And it's going to be dead simple, because you can see where people are walking. So all that intense training that we'd done in Australia of picking up tracks in virgin bush and looking for broken leaves and footprints, it suddenly didn't apply. We were suddenly on a track that could be mined or have wires across it, be booby trapped, and we could be ambushed. So I'm tracking along there, and it suddenly occurs to me that I am really, really a sitting duck. I'm going to get shot if this dog doesn't do his job. Well, after I'd gone about 100 metres, I fell in a hole. I just disappeared in a hole. And I stood up and I realised I was standing in an enemy weapon pit. And I looked back, and the Australians are looking at me like, what's the matter with you, you bloody idiot? You've just fallen down a hole. And the dog's looking at me. Are we going to get going or what? And I'm standing in an enemy weapon pit where the enemy crouch and shoot at you. I got out, I got the dog tracking again. I thought, we're getting close. And he pointed. And as he pointed, I looked up ahead of me and I saw what looked like a white blanket on the ground. And as I got down to the knee and I lifted my rifle, this white blanket just rose into the air and just disintegrated everywhere. And it was hundreds and hundreds of white butterflies sitting on a man's body. He had been a wounded Viet Cong and he had died. And his mates had left him. So I pulled the dog back and called the other diggers up and I said, that's our first track. He's dead. So there was a big conflict, and that was the first experience of tracking. The person that we were following had already died from wounds. And that night we stayed in the jungle, and we stayed with the rifle platoon and called in artillery, and that was my first actual night out in combat as well.
How had you felt about that first experience?
Can I just, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to, okay, roll.
So how were you feeling about that first contact? Had it been a success for you, a failure?
Well, I looked upon it as a failure. It was anticlimax. Obviously, it was anticlimax because I was expecting to walk into a firefight, or the dog was going to point and we're going to have a big punch up and the rest of it. And the person that we followed was dead, had died. The others who were with him had to keep moving. So we could have gone on tracking. But it was decided then that we'd stop. And yeah, that was basically what happened. It was, the whole thing had just been unreal. It was like, you've been rehearsing and practicing for months and months and months, and we got on the ground and it was on for real. We had real bullets. The diggers behind were switched on and ready to fire, and they'd already been in a contact anyway. They'd had their first taste of action. The people we were tracking now were not Australians running ahead of us and laying a dummy track. The people ahead of us were an enemy who I hadn't seen. They had fired and tried to kill these other guys, and these guys had tried to kill them. And there were bodies on the ground from those that were dead. And the first sight of actually looking at somebody that was actually hit by automatic fire was the first time I looked at it. It was like he was a young man. He had a black and green uniform on. He'd obviously had a rifle, which was now away from, and it looked like he'd been hit by an automatic high velocity bullets fired by Australians, and it looked like a volcano had gone off in his body. Everything was like shattered and broken, and the expression on his face was actually shock of impact. Eyes wide open and locked wide open, like it suddenly had an incredible fright. But that's what had happened as these bullets had hit him. And I looked at him and thought, I didn't have time to think about things. I was looking at him to think, it is a young guy like me, that was it. But also, we wanted to kill him, and if he's got any mates, we're going to kill them too. And I had no problem with that at all. I didn't have any reservations about walking along the track, and if I saw anybody else like him, I was going to shoot them. I think that had a lot to do with training. Everything was going to be reflexive. There was not going to be any freezing. I wasn't going to freeze and be struck with terror. I was just going to shoot him straight off. And Les, the guy behind me, was going to do the same thing. That actual confrontation I anticipated confrontation I was going to have with the enemy was not going to be a problem. That was not going to be a problem. It'd be a target on a shooting range, and I'd shoot him and kill him. My problem was him shooting me. That was all I gave a stuff about, was the dog might stuff up, I might stuff up, and I'm going to walk and some bastard's going to shoot me. And there was the self-preservation factor, or the factor of being wounded or hit or killed by bullets, like what I'd just seen. That was my greatest concern, and what made my mouth so dry was that I'd stuff things up. And what we'd been trained to do wouldn't work. And the dog had missed the point, and I'd suddenly stumble on 4 or 5 Viet Cong, and they'd get me before I got them. Those are my concerns. And instead I fell down this bloody hole. And it wasn't supposed to happen that way. I shouldn't have fallen down a hole, because I should have seen it. It could have been a booby trap. But in fact, it was covered in ferns, and it was very close to the side of the track. And I was watching the dog, and the dog maybe swung left, and I probably stepped to the right and went straight into this hole. It could have been a punji pit full of spikes, but it wasn't. So there was an unreality and an anticlimactic feeling about that first track. But then as the days and weeks and months went by and we did more, we started to get results. Things started to happen. Bad things happened, and we had success and we had failure. Same with Marcus and Dennis. The battalion used us quite frequently, but also the process as we went through the weeks and the months, we started to wear down physically. It's probably one of the aspects that you didn't notice about the war, was the fact that you were deteriorating, both physically and mentally. Incrementally, you were being chipped away like water on the stone, and that's an aspect of war that you didn't realise until you were actually right into it. The way it sucked everything out of you, basically because of continual tension.
Can you try and describe that to me?
Well, when I wrote the book about how I felt, I remembered some occasions that I'd actually took a look at myself. The steel mirror that my mother and father gave to me, I put on the rubber tree outside the tent. And I used to shave outside there. Using a bowl, I used to shave looking in that mirror. And I know I looked in the mirror at one stage, and I think I'd just, maybe just before I turned 20, I was still 19, I think. And I looked at myself, and I really looked, and my eyes had sunk into my head, and I had big bags under here. My cheeks had sunk in, my skin had gone a sallowy colour, and I looked as if I was about 50. And I felt like that too. The thing about war that soldiers will tell you is combatants, I'll talk about combatants, not just, I mean real combatants, is that you don't realise probably until you look back that you were exhausted all the time. Every day you were tired because you hardly slept. And every day you were pushing on intense physical demand on you all the time. You weren't eating properly, you were eating rations most of the time. And you were carrying 60 to 70 pounds. And you were working through horrendous conditions, which was usually monsoon, rain, or very, very dry season with hardly any water. And you were on a level of stress all the time, of anticipation of combat. Now, all of that gradually sucked it out of you, and after a few months, not long, after a few months, you're physically and mentally started to deteriorate. And that was when you got killed, because that was when you switched off. And with the dog, I had added complications because I had to look after this animal, and this animal had to look after me. And we sort of, in war, generally men buddy off with a buddy. So you look after each other, you'll make a brew for each other in the jungle and watch out for each other, and I'll make your meal, you make mine, you know, so you're actually working in a buddy system. In the case of a dog and a dog handler, it was different because I couldn't buddy with anybody because I had a dog. And I couldn't talk to him. I talked to him a lot, and he talked to me, I suppose. But I also had to feed him. I had to carry his food and my food. And at night we had to be together, so I wasn't with another guy. It became a sort of a most unusual sort of, very difficult to describe to somebody a sort of a relationship like that. Eventually, you could probably think you're going mad because you become such good mates with an animal. And we actually looked at each other, and he'd know what I was thinking, and I know what he was thinking. And he'd come close to me at night and snuggle in at night. I'd sleep between my legs. I always wrapped his lead around my leg at night, his walking lead, because it was always pitch black. And if he walked off, he might not get back to me. And also, if he walked off into the jungle, he might turn and come back and somebody would shoot him. So we were always close, and we shared space under a shelter, plastic shelter in the rain, and we used to fight over space. Same with Dennis and Marcus. Dennis was a short guy and had a huge dog. I was a bit bigger and had a smaller dog. So these shelters were made for one person to sleep under. And getting under there with a dog, you're always trying to push him out. He was trying to push you out when it was raining. The other thing about Caesar was he was helicopter mad. And I didn't realise this till I got to Vietnam. Dogs react to sounds differently. Like some dogs don't like the Mr. Whippy ice cream van and the bell, they'll bark and go crackers. Other dogs don't like firecrackers. Some don't like high-pitched sounds, and they go mad. Caesar went mad at the sound of chopping rotor blades. So every time we were going to get on a helicopter, he went berserk and tried to jump up and bite the blades. And after he'd done this about 10 to 20 times, I wanted to kill him. I really wanted to kill him. But I couldn't stand it anymore. He would go berserk to get onto a helicopter. When we started to fly, he'd settle down. When we landed, he'd jump off and go berserk again. And he did that for nearly the full 12 months. And sometimes I nearly had my head chopped off by the back rotor. And he'd still be trying to jump up and grab them as the helicopter was taking off. And I couldn't break him of this habit. He was just mad. Absolutely maddening. He'd jump in the door and go flying through the door straight out the other side while I was rolling through behind him trying to grab him. Because there's a couple of door gunners ran over and they're trying to help me get the dog back on the helicopter. And this was an aspect to the tour that was berserk, drove me berserk.
Were you able to train the dogs to detect a mine or a booby trap?
Well, you can train a dog as a mine dog. And you can train a dog. The Americans had something like 40,000 dogs, I think. I think that was the figure I heard. And their dogs covered a variety of roles. That was scout dogs, tracking dogs, they had tunnel dogs, and the bulk of their animals were guard and attack dogs for guarding assets and complexes and so on. So they had some dogs that were trained to detect mines, but we didn't, and our dogs were not trained to detect an underground anti-personnel type mine, and that we expected them to treat a booby trap above ground or a wire as they would a person by pointing. So when we got to Vietnam, this became a very unpleasant experience very quickly for me in particular. I had 2 encounters with minefields. Dennis had one, and I think other guys did as well, but mine were most memorable because the dog had to perform outside of his parameters to deal with the situation.
Can you
and
tell
I
us
had to try and read it.
Can you tell us what happened when you encountered that first?
Well,
mine
the
field
first
with Caesar?
the most deadly sort of mine that was used in Vietnam was called a jumping jack, or a bouncing Betty, an M16 mine. It was an American mine, and it was used by the Allied forces against the enemy. It was basically the size of a large jam can, and it was below the ground, and 3 prongs just sat above the ground. When you trod on the prongs, they went down and it went click. As soon as the foot was removed, the first detonation went off and it blew the can into the air, and the can exploded at waist height, and it shot out this hail of shrapnel at waist height, so it caused maximum effect. It didn't blow off your foot and that sort of thing. It actually sprayed you with the shrapnel. Now, the enemy actually stole those mines or lifted them from a big fence minefield that the Australians had, which became fairly notorious. It was a large minefield that ran several k's, and it was to prevent enemy from passing one part of the province into the other. And it was arguably the task force's greatest folly, because the enemy came in, lifted them, took them away, and used them against us. So the first experience that I ever had with mines was during a track when we were flown in to an area in Phuc Tui where a contact had occurred and the enemy had bolted, and they'd shot off along a fairly sandy track, and it was going to be a standard follow-up. We had a platoon of infantry ready to follow us immediately behind us, and there was myself and my cover man and a visual tracker. And I set Caesar on the trail, and away he went because there'd been blood from the contact. And he followed it up, and we followed along this dirt trail for several hundred metres. And the Australian follow-up force spread themselves on both sides of the track so they wouldn't walk on it because of mines.
How are you feeling when you walk on this track?
I followed basically the enemy footprints. So in some respects, I was walking on safe ground. I was running over ground that had just been run over by the enemy. But we weren't to know that what they had done is they placed the mines either side of the track, knowing that the Australians would walk either side of the track. And I came to this T-junction, and Caesar just stopped, and he dropped his head. It wasn't a point, and he flinched away and sort of walked back to me. And I urged him to go on, to keep tracking, because we were standing on an open track, and we didn't want to stand still for too long, because you're in a situation of enfiladed fire. You could be shot at along the track quite easily. But he wouldn't go on, and he came back, and I urged him forward, and he refused to go any further past this T-junction, and he sat on my foot. And this is something that he'd never done before. And I knew something was wrong, but as I urged him to move forward a few more paces, the first explosion went off, and it occurred on my right-hand side. And the Australians, moving up both sides of the bush either side of me, trod on an M16 mine. The platoon commander trod on an M16 mine, and it blew up. And it blew him up, took his legs off, injured his signaller and 2 or 3 others that were close by. So somebody screamed, freeze, and we all just dropped and propped where we were, didn't move. And I pulled the dog back, and I grabbed hold of him, and I'd rolled sideways into a bush, because I didn't want to lay on the track. And we just froze there. And while we were doing that, they tried to, they gave first aid to the platoon commander, and the others that were wounded, and called for a dust-off helicopter. Well, 2 helicopters came in. The first one came in, was actually doing the dust-off, and it lowered the winch and pulled up the wounded platoon commander and the other wounded men, and the second dust-off lowered down a team of engineers with minesweeping equipment. They got the minesweepers out and came up behind us and swept the track. Then they swept round me, and they said, well, where did the dog go? I said it went about 20 paces up in front and refused to track it, came back. So they swept up the front, which is normal procedure to see what's under the ground. And then they went down on a spot where they thought that there was another mine, and they dug around and they uncovered it and came back and said, well, you are the luckiest man alive. Your dog has just saved your life and probably everyone else's, because in front of you is a 250-pound unexploded bomb, and that's connected to 4 other M16 mines. So if you trod on the M16 mine, it would have triggered the 250-pound American unexploded bomb that fell out of a bomber. And it would have taken the whole platoon, everyone out. Just would have been a crater in the ground. So that actually was the second experience I had with mines, as far as mines blowing up went. We were flown out, and I was fairly sick. I felt fairly sick after that.
What?
Well, when the explosion went off, it picked me up and it threw me forward, and I felt as if I'd been hit in the back. And I felt all this water, this hot liquid just squirting down my legs. So I thought I was just bleeding from the back. But actually, I pissed myself with a shock.
How was Caesar?
Well, he just turned around and sort of looked at me like, look what you've brought us into this time. He didn't react to the explosion. He detected that bomb. There's no question about it. And he stopped me going forward any further. He knew something was bad there, and it probably smelled of enemy. But also, after the war, I came to realise that dogs have another sense that we can't pick up on. And it's a sense of foreboding. They know something's wrong. They pick up vibrations that we don't detect. It's another sort of sixth sense that dogs have. And he knew that was potentially lethal, what was up the front there. The other mine experience.
Well, just staying on that.
Sure.
Sorry, I'd just like to. It is quite an incident that illustrates many things about what happened to the Australians there, particularly the mine injury. And how was the platoon commander? Was he conscious? Was he able to give orders, or
the actual? I thank God really that the actual event, the explosion, occurred behind shrubs and bush, and I never saw what occurred, but I felt it, and the flash was like a camera flash. And I heard groaning, men shouting mine, and I, like everyone else, I froze and dropped to the spot because somebody yelled mines. I knew it was a mine. I often wonder about that particular platoon commander because he was a reinforcement lieutenant who went through the reinforcement stream over to Vietnam to replace other platoon commanders over there who had obviously his time expired or he was on and he'd just gone out for that day. That was his first time in the field as a platoon commander. And I often thought about, I had a guilt feeling that I had led men into a minefield. Well, I hadn't led them in, but I felt that I'd just led a platoon of men into a minefield. And I went into depression afterwards. We were sitting on the landing zone ready to be lifted out afterwards, and I thought, these guys are going to come around and they're really going to have a go at me, how dare you, it's in a minefield and all the rest of it. They didn't. They actually came around and they said, good dog, job well done, even though they were all in a state of shock. It took me a while to get over there. I still had the pain in my back for quite a few days. I flew back to Nuyat, and I went back to my tent after I put the dog in the run. I carried my gear back down and I just felt awful. I walked into my tent and I threw my equipment on the floor, and Dennis was sitting there at the table and he said, you know, how'd your day go? I said, that was one of the shittiest days of my life. We walked into a bloody minefield. And I had my rifle, M16 Armalite rifle, and the rifle, when I'd gone down, had gone barrel first into the dirt, and I hadn't had time to clean it. And I knew I had to clean that rifle and get it ready for the next job, whatever it was going to be. So I was sitting on the cot and I pulled the magazine off, and I pulled the bolt and everything else out, and I cleaned it and dusted it and used a pull through to get the dirt out of the barrel and oiled it all up. And then I pulled the bolt action back and it locked, which it was supposed to do. And I put a magazine on. Then I hit the bolt release and the magazine went forward and carried a bullet into the chamber. I did things the wrong way around. And then I fired the action, because I fired the action and it went off in the tent. And the bullet went straight past Dennis Ferguson's neck by about 3 inches and straight out the side of the tent. And he hit the floor and he knocked his coffee over. And I saw this liquid gave, and I thought, I've just shot my mate. And the other guy in the tent with us, he hit the floor too. Of course, it was an incredibly loud bang. And I just looked down and I realised that I'd had an accidental discharge, or an AD. You know, an AD is one of the worst offences you can have in the army. It's very severe punishment for that. And Dennis stood up and I thought, he's alive, I haven't killed him. And he said, make a run for it. So, you know, where are you going to run in Vietnam? And I stood up and 2 RPs came into the tent, took my name and number and the rest of it. And I got 14 days of field punishment and a $40 fine out of that. But it actually happened because of the shocking state that I was in. I was still in this post-traumatic state after this explosion. And I explained it to the commanding officer when he sentenced me. And he said, well, you just got to learn to be more careful, you know. I thought, I won't go into detail. I won't tell him what sort of day I'd had. But the other incident in regard to mines was a bit more bizarre, and it would have been humorous, but for the fact you were dealing with mines. We were doing a village search, and the rifle company was searching the village. Like, they'd go into villages occasionally, turn them upside down, check the people, look for ID cards, try and find caches of hidden weapons and that sort of thing. And the trackers were called in, and we just basically stood around in case something happened, somebody ran off, or they wanted to use the dogs, and they were standing around there. And lunchtime came, and the platoon commander of the rifle platoon that I was with said, look, you and your dog, you can just hang around with us while we have lunch. We're just going to move off the road. And we stepped off the road into a dry rice paddy. Plenty of dry rice paddies in Vietnam, and we've been in them many times. And we all spread out, as soldiers normally do. You spread out. You never cluster together in case somebody fires at you. And we sat down, and I sat down with a scout, the platoon scout, and he was making a brew, and I was making a brew over a little hexamine block, heating water up, and Caesar was next to me. And he decided he wanted to have a crap. So he went into a hunch, and the scout said, oh, mate, not in front of us, you know. And I said, oh, sure enough. I said, go over there, go on, go over there and have your poo over there. And I unhooked his lead. Now, you should never unhook the lead off the dog. It should never be done, but he was a trained dog, and if you called him back, he'd come. So he's patted away about 20 to 30 paces and started to have a crap. And at that very instant, there was a man came running along the road, an Arvin, a member of the South Vietnamese military, and he shouted out, nobody move, you're having your lunch in a minefield. So there was about 20 to 30 guys sitting in this minefield, and we just all froze, and you feel this sudden cold wash over you, you know, and you look at the dirt around you. Every bit of dirt around you is now explosive, and you're just looking for those 3 prongs. And the scout looked at me, and then he looked at the dog and looked back and he said, can a dog set a mine off? And I thought, God, gee, he walks back, he's probably going to tread on a bloody mine. And all the training that I'd done in Australia just clicked in. All that obedience training at that moment just came in. And I said, Caesar, stay, down, stay. And he just sat, put his paws out, sat down and just lay perfectly still. And I said, just stay there. And it was a very, very hot day, and he was actually baking in the sun. We had no shade. And the scout looked at me and said, "Thank God," because the dog hadn't moved. And we got our bayonets out, and everybody started to just prod around themselves with these bayonets, just waiting for a clink. And I cleared my ground, and the scout cleared around him. He was about where you were. And then I started to prod out towards the dog. And he sat up. I said, don't, sit down. He sat down again. And I just kept prodding a pathway through to him. And shortly, within a couple of minutes, a helicopter came in. And it had an engineering team on that were going to drop off and clear it. And I knew that this dog was going to go berserk at helicopters, because I knew that was his pattern. And he would run at that helicopter. And I just said, stay, and I'm gritting through my teeth. Don't you move, you bastard. Don't you bloody move. And this helicopter's going clank, 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 clank on the road, and the engineers are getting their gear out. And he stayed perfectly still. He didn't move. Anyway, the engineer came over, and they swept around me and swept up to the dog and cleared him, and I got the dog out. And afterwards, we're sort of laughing ourselves at how ludicrous it is. We're all sitting there in a minefield eating, and none of us trod on a mine. They were apparently all over the place. Now, that was the second experience I had with mines, or the first one. Later came the contact one. But many soldiers, pardon me, many Australians had shocking experiences with mines. And I think that most of our wounded in Vietnam were as a result of mine explosions. The thing about mines is they're a weapon of terror. They, if you know they're around, they virtually paralyse you. Because the mine isn't necessarily made to kill anybody. It's actually, it's designed to maim. And the enemy used them because they knew if they injured an Australian, blew his foot off, blew his hand off, blew his eyes out or whatever, it was going to tie up resources to get that one single wounded person out. And the only consolation we had in Vietnam really was the dust-off casualty evacuation was the greatest in the world. Within minutes they were there, and within under 10 minutes easy, you're on an operating table.
Can you take us back to a time when you were that first dust-off? Was that with the platoon commander? Was it or?
Yeah, well, they evacuated those guys and they got them out. I think there were three injuries. The platoon commander, I never knew his name. I didn't know who he was. I never saw him. But I was told by a friend, a platoon commander, years later in peacetime, that who the guy was and the fact that he was okay, and he had prosthetics, and he was getting on with his life. He'd survived okay.
What was the first time you made contact when there was, where you successfully identified?
Well, the first full-on firefight that we had was actually a classic track, and it was a textbook. It was called Operation Santa Fe, and it was November of 1967. And the Australians were working in association with the Americans on a very big operation in Phuoc Tuy province, but right up north. And we were on call in case there was a contact. And the Americans were actually doing what's called a land clearance. Now, in Vietnam, they had features called fire trails, and that involved two big bulldozers with a anchor chain between them. And they would cleave their way through the jungle and pull all the jungle down and flatten it like you're going to prepare a freeway, a couple of 100 metres wide, for kilometres long. And the idea of that was to actually deny access for the Viet Cong to move freely through the jungle across the whole of the province. And they would have to go across a cleared area. So their footprints could be seen, and aerial surveillance could pick them up. But also the fire trail was an area where the Allied forces could move up and establish fire support bases on, where they put the big guns in, and the guns would actually support the artillery. And it had barbed wire around it, and there was 30 or 40 men inside there. It was called a fire base. It was a Vietnam phenomenon. The Americans were doing land clearance, and their bulldozers were cutting their way through the jungle with this anchor chain, with soldiers either side. They had protection of that. But the Viet Cong were actually coming up to the edge of the jungle and firing rocket-propelled grenades at these bulldozers, and they killed a couple of drivers. And the Americans were getting pretty pissed off about getting hit all the time like this, so they decided that they wanted to find out and follow this group of Viet Cong up, because they'd melt away into the jungle. So they notified the Australians, and this our commander said, well, we've got tracking teams, we could follow it up for you. So it was November the 4th, I remember the date, because it was such a huge day. This American chopper came in, we're on a fire base, picked me and Caesar up, and the team commander that we had, Bob Moody, and another team commander called Bill Lofts, and the four of us flew out. And we were flying for ages. And eventually we came down into this fire trail where these Americans were. They were attached to the 3rd of the 5th Cavalry. That means that basically their unit was armoured personnel carriers. They tore around in these armoured personnel carriers. They were from the old cavalry days when they used to ride horses. Now they had carriers and tanks. And we landed and got out, and we were suddenly with a group of American soldiers. We hadn't been with Americans before. And they said, oh, we're glad to have you here. We're having a real problem. This is what's happening. They're coming up shooting rockets at us, and they're peeing off into the jungle. We want to follow up, and we want to kill them. So this was the sort of job we were made for. So we had about 8 to 10 GIs behind us, and there was Bob, who was the team commander, who was going to also act as my cover man, and Bill, the other Australian, who was doing the navigation. So as we were tearing through the jungle, he basically following where we went on a map as best he could. That was critical, because if you had a major contact, you had to know where you were to call artillery or gunships. Bob found the tracks, the boot prints, and he said there's about 6 or 7 of them, and they've headed off along that track. So I hooked Caesar up, and we took off. It lasted for about a mile of just going through this jungle, and it was so quiet, and it was so ghostly. It was like drifting through an aquarium. It was really, really thick jungle, triple canopy in parts, and it was almost black down the bottom, so dark.
How are you moving?
Well, I was walking behind Caesar, and Caesar was just trotting along, and once again he was on a track or a trail, which is where this enemy had gone. And there were dozens of trails winding off all over the place. But Caesar just went from one to the other, to the other, to the other, following the scent. It was like he was hooked to an invisible wire. And we were moving along at a real pace. And the American crowd behind us, I could hear everybody was wheezing, because it was saturation hot. And the first scare I got, the dog jerked back, and I thought, that's a point. I dropped my rifle, and there was a crate. That's a highly venomous Asian snake, banded crate on the track. Got him out of the way, carried on tracking a bit further, and walked through a bomb crater, toppled down the bomb crater, an upper bomb crater, the B-52 bomb crater.
How big was the crater?
That was about 10 to 15 metres across. A bomb had dropped straight down through the jungle and blown up. It was probably a stray bomb. But it was deathly quiet, and there was no sounds. It was just the dog, and the lead. I was following the lead.
How far behind you is the patrol?
Well, immediately. Behind me is Bob, with the rifle, covering me. Behind him was Bill, and behind him was a man with a machine gun. And then, just a few metres behind that, were the other 8 to 9 men. They were all travelling as a very fast on-foot patrol, going along very quickly. They had to slow me down at a couple of times because we were travelling too quickly, and Bill couldn't keep up with the map work. He had to stop and do his map checks. Because as he's going along, he had a sheep counter, and he was counting his paces off with a sheep counter. And should remember this, about 110 paces is about 100 metres, I think. So he could follow direction of the compass and the distance. There was no road on the map, it was just jungle. So he knew basically where we were going. I was beginning to sort of drift a bit because I was so fatigued. I was beginning to drift, and I kept watching the dog, and suddenly his ears just went whack straight out, and he just stopped. It was a classic point. And I froze, and as I looked up ahead, about 15 metres ahead, through the jungle trees, I just saw this person's arm move, and a face, and I pulled the dog quietly back to me, because the tracking dogs are very quiet, they don't make any noise at all. And I looked again and I could see that it was a Viet Cong, and he was actually looking straight up through the trees at the sun, and the sun was shining straight down on his face. And I had him cold. He did not know I was there. So I turned around and gave a thumbs down to Bob. That meant this enemy in front. And I said 10 to 15 metres up in front of us, and Bob moved around me. And then I sort of looked around him, and there were at least 7 just moving, and they were like having an afternoon lunch, just like guys having a break, you know. They felt quite safe. They didn't know that they'd been followed. And Bob looked at them, and then he turned back, and then he motioned for the follow-up patrol to spread out in an extended line through the bush for an assault. And the Americans sort of moved through the bush and tried to shake themselves out. They knew what to do, but they made a bit of noise, and this guy just, suddenly he went still. And Bob just lifted the rifle up and went bang, bang, just shot him straight away. And as he shot him, I'd never seen a man actually hit with bullets before. It was like he actually trod on a lot of marbles and just flew up in the air. Because the impact of a high velocity military bullet is absolutely, it's enormous. All that, once that energy hits somebody, it doesn't blow people apart or anything. It just goes in and straight out. And as it goes out, it takes bits and pieces with it. But the impact of all the energy suddenly released lifts people up off the ground. It's not like television. There's no sort of gymnastics in that. It just throws people up and down, or just drop straight forward. The the patrol then opened up fire. There was a whole sheet of gunfire straight from them, straight towards where the enemy were, and there was a machine gun on the track that was actually trained on me. I knew that machine gun was there, but there was nobody sitting on it. Thankfully, there was nobody on it because they didn't think anybody was coming. And I just saw a man sort of moving across to it in sort of slow motion. I just lifted my rifle and just kept shooting at him until he went down. But the confusion of a gunfire, of a gun battle, or a firefight, it's like happens in 5 to 10 seconds and it's finished. But it seems that everything goes in sort of slow motion. People are moving slowly. I remember taking my magazine off my rifle and putting a new one on. I remember holding the dog round back next to me to the tree, going through the actions exactly as I've been trained to do. Magazine on, bolt release forward, lift up, look, fire. There's nothing personal about it at all. It's not I'm going to kill that man or anything. It's just shoot at something that's moving.
Had you had to reload?
Well, with an Armalite and M16, I had it set on automatic. I always carried it on automatic. In case I bounced anybody in front of me while I was tracking, I'd hold the trigger back and I'd fire 20 rounds. But it's like the rate of fire, it's gone in like a second and a half. So you should never have it on automatic fire. You should have it on a semi-automatic, where you fire one shot at a time. And I'd fired, the whole magazine was just gone, so I dropped it off, pulled another one on. I had 8 magazines. And then I fired on semi-automatic, but like it was all finished, it was gone. Bob was yelling out, ceasefire, and it was only for seconds, it was all over. And the American support group just swept straight through this position where the enemy had been. And then we moved forward, and I actually had a look, and there was one dead, another one was lying over there, and there was one man, one Viet Cong, probably the one that was looking up at the sun. He'd been hit in the centre of his body, and the bullet had taken quite a bit out of his back, and there was red, frothy blood coming out of his back, so he'd gone through his lungs. And he was going to die, most certainly within a minute or two. And the American lieutenant who was with us, in charge of his troops, he said, "Well, take him back for questioning." And we said, "He's finished, dead, finished, let's go. We've got to get out now. We're going to get hit." Because they would regroup and come back. And we just wanted to shoot through and get straight back where we'd come back to the armoured personnel carriers, which were waiting for us at the clearing. And he said, "No, I want this man taken back for questioning." Well, we didn't. We started to rip things to pieces and put him on a stretcher, and 2 Americans picked him up, and they started to lug him back, and I was walking behind them. And Bob led the way back because he had a terrific instinct for direction and distances. He knew where to go. So the track we'd walk back out on, all those tracks, he actually knew the way out, although we'd mapped ourselves coming in. And we were only halfway down on these. I saw these two Americans just tip the wounded man off and just roll him down into the bomb crater that would come through, so they could get rid of him. And they said, "Well, sorry, sir, he's actually died." You know, I said, "It doesn't matter. Let's just keep going." And they said, "Well, that got rid of that bloody problem." And we headed back to the clearing, and we heard the APCs revving up, and we broke through and we got through. We said, "We've got them. We've killed them all. Get into the carriers and let's head back to the fire support base, the American fire support base." So we jumped in the carriers and we all took off. And I was in this armoured personnel carrier with a dog by myself, the driver and the guy sitting up the top. And Bob was in the one in front and the other Americans were in those in front. We were just rolling along this clearing, the fire trail, going at full stick. And suddenly we got hit, we got ambushed. First thing I heard was whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. And there was a flash in front of this lead carrier. An RPG had been fired at it. And then another whoosh, and I heard this crump, bang, it hit the dirt. We'd been we'd been ambushed from the jungle on the side of the clearing. So all the carriers turned around and just headed straight towards it, and everybody just opened up with a wall of fire, straight on it. And I sat on the top end, I'm using all my magazines up, just shooting at the jungle. And Caesar was down below, and he was getting all these shells falling on top of his head, so he wasn't very happy about that. Anyway, it stopped, we turned, and we made a run for home. And we got home to the American position. We all got out, and they're all high-fiving, and a few blokes lit up a toke, you know. And I gave Caesar a drink, and everybody came around, that patting the dog on the head. "Gee, that's a good dog, you know. He's a goot killer, that dog." And he pricked his ears up, and the chopper was coming in. And this helicopter landed, and they offloaded steaks, potatoes, veggies, gravy, and cases of beer and chocolate milk. And we all sat down and had a great big feast. That was the end of the fight for the day.
When you're there, when you're firing a magazine on and fully automatic, and how's Caesar reacting to this? I mean, it's a God almighty noise. It's just complete chaos.
Yeah, I never paid any attention to him. And he never did anything, he never tried to run away or never, shook with fright or anything like that. The impact on his ears would have been enormous. Obviously the same as for us humans. But he never reacted to it. He just seemed to be there. And I never paid any attention to him. I was too busy doing what I was doing. The only time that he ever went bonkers was when choppers were coming in. The sound of the thud, clack, 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 chop, chop, thwacka, 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 thwacka. That sound was the sound that drove him mad.
Do you think he became a soldier in a way? He knew what you were doing, or how he perceived war was very similar to the way you perceived what you were doing?
No, I don't think he did. He was having an adventure. He was living his dog's life. Nobody was trying to hurt him. And, everybody loved him. I mean, all the other guys were always patting him and giving him drinks, and they'd go out and talk to him, because in a world of the abnormal, the Labrador, Australian Kelpie Labrador dog was just something that was normal. We were in war zones, and everything about you was just horrible, or it was just an abnormal. It was an abnormal war zone, like all war zones are abnormal for all people, all soldiers. And this dog was completely normal. He was a little bit of Australia that was absolutely normal. So people would come around and pat him and make a fuss of him and all the rest of him. They weren't supposed to, but I didn't mind. You're supposed to not let other people pat the dog, but he was that sort of dog that you'd pat it. Marcus was even worse, because Marcus would roll over and want his tummy scratched. He was one of those great big floppy Labradors. And bang bangs and like artillery fire on a fire support base, it's just deafening when 105 howitzers open up. Particularly at night, you've got the flash and the reverberation through the ground, and everybody around it within 50 to 100 metres, you can feel the shake. That didn't bother him. The one time that he did have, I suppose, no, I can't recall. He had a shaking fit once, but I don't really remember what triggered it. We were never under artillery fire or anything like that. On one of the fire support bases during the Tet Offensive of 1967-68 was when the big Tet Offensive occurred in Vietnam. We were on a fire support base then, and we got probed, and there was some rocket fire and incoming fire against us, and we were actually in a bunker, in a sandbag bunker. And the artillery opened up that night to fire back. But the guns that actually fired were American guns, and there were 155mm guns. And the sound of the detonation of them firing was twice as loud as an ordinary artillery piece, and they were very close to us. And when it went off, because they were close to us, we got the concussion from the cone of concussion as it fired, and it was firing Splintex darts because the enemy were at the front. The cone of concussion passed across where we were, and it was like an earthquake passing over the top, and that was really shocking. And I think that one made Caesar break down with a fit of shaking, because I remember actually hugging him and putting a flak jacket around him because he didn't look too good. That was the only time I ever saw him suffer as a result of the sounds of battle. Gunfire was just, although it was deafening, it didn't bother him, and I never paid any attention to him. So after the event, he seemed okay, so I thought he must have been all right. One of the tracking dogs in Vietnam, it may have been Tiber or one of the others. I can't remember which dog it was. He was on fire support base Coral when that was actually mortared and under fire by enemy forces, and those shells landed inside the perimeter. And he took off. He shot through, and he didn't come back till the next day. They couldn't find him, and he suffered. He never worked again, that dog, I don't think. He was really shaken up. He was basically kept as a pet at Nui Dad.
Peter, these were some pretty extraordinary experiences you're having. Can you tell me about your relationship with Caesar during this period of time, over this 12 months?
My relationship with?
With Caesar?
It was a relationship that probably can't be put into words. I mean, it's only when I reflect after the event that I realise what the relationship was, because going through the 12 months of Vietnam, a very intense sort of period, and we were just doing our job, going out, coming in, walking through the bush, miserable, tired and irritated with each other. Sometimes I just wish I could dump him. Because walking through the jungle with a dog, not tracking, but actually I did a lot of walking with that dog next to me on patrols when we weren't tracking. And walking through the jungle on a patrol is not a particularly easy experience, because it stops, start, move slowly, move quicker, stop, start, sit down, wait. That's the way a patrol goes when it travels through heavy country. So I had a dog on a short walking lead of about 2 feet, just a short walking lead that people have for their dogs, and he had to walk next to me. And we got tangled and tripped over and fell over every vine. We tripped over every root. He got in front of me, I fell over him. He wanted to stop and have a crap and nobody else did. And it just became a sort of misery for hours and hours and hours. And I hated him. I hated that dog sometimes, because he was an inconvenience to my life. And I just I hated being a tracker, tracking dog handler, because nobody else had my problems. You know, I had problems. Nobody else had problems. That's what I thought. They were their own people, and they carried their own gear and were responsible for themselves. They didn't have to worry about anybody else. But I had this bloody dog, and at night I had to open a can of food, because we had to carry cans of dog food as men carried rations, and I had to spread some of the cans so that other guys could carry it because I couldn't carry all the weight. I had to carry 3 extra bottles of water, and some other guys carried water as well because we had to have water for the dog. And in addition to that, I had to think of his comfort and convenience as well as my own. So at night when we used to crash, and I'd clear a little clearing area where I could put down a sheet, and I may put up the shelter depending on whether it was going to rain or not. I always had to make extra space for him. And when the situation arose where we dug a shell scrape, what people would know as a foxhole, guys would dig their little shell scrape a foot deep to try and get their bodies below ground in case there was a mortar attack, and basically their length. And I had to make mine bigger because the bloody dog had to be put in there as well. So these things just compounded and compounded at the end of 12 months. I'd had him, and he probably had me. We still called out doing tracks, although towards the end of our 12 months of Vietnam, we weren't being used much at all because the level of intensity of the war had heightened so much there was no longer a requirement to chase enemy. It was basically full-on warfare anyway. Other dog handlers had similar problems. Other dog handlers got shot at. One got wounded in the hand. No dog was shot. Sometimes the dogs pointed, and the platoon commander wanted the dog to track on, which was fatal if you did it. So, everybody had their own sort of dog adventures, and Caesar was my dog adventure, and Dennis had the same situation with him. Dennis had a stronger, I feel, bonding and relationship with Marcus than I had with Caesar. I'm not sure why. They were very, very close, those two. And it could be that Dennis had a sort of a greater threshold of pain than that I had, and he probably had more tolerance. But the situation with Dennis Ferguson was a very unusual one because at the end of our 12 months tour, we both went home and both of those dogs were left in Vietnam, and they were handed over to reinforcement handlers that came over. But 2 years later, Dennis went back to Vietnam, and he was teamed up with that dog again, which was absolutely remarkable. I've never known that happen before. He ended up with the dog that he'd had 2 years before, and he had him for another 12 months in action. When I went back to Vietnam, that situation didn't occur because Caesar had been pensioned off and he'd gone to Saigon and he'd been given away. So he had finished his war service, so to speak, during the period of time that I was back in Australia as an instructor, and I never got to see him again. But he went to a man who was with the Australian Embassy, and he was a family pet to that man and his family. And he had a good life at the end because after I wrote the book Trackers, this particular man read the story and wrote me a letter and said, are you sitting down? I'm going to give you some news. I'm the man that got your dog. And he was wonderful. He said he was such a good family pet, and he was such a man's dog. We used to take him surfing down at Back Beach at Vung Tau, and he'd sit and watch me shave every morning. When I used to shave, he'd come up and watch me shaving. And his peculiar habit was when I used to sit on the toilet, he demanded sitting there watching me while I was sitting on the toilet. Well, that's what Caesar used to do to me in the jungle, you see. He used to watch me when I was going to the toilet. So,
why?
Well, there's nothing else to look at. It was just, and I had to take him. I mean, I couldn't put him anywhere. So when I went to carry out my basic functions in the bush, I had to take him along with me. And when he went and did his, I had to walk with him while he did his because I demanded that he actually carry out his toilet requirements outside of the perimeter if we were harboured at night. I thought it was only proper to do that. So I'd walk. We had a machine gun at 9, 4 and 8 o'clock, and then the men were spread out through the bush to collect that and form the circle, which was called the harbour position. And anybody that had to go to a toilet urgently, they would walk out through the machine gun, just directly out in front, carry out their functions, and then they would walk straight back into that gun again. Otherwise, you'd have accidents, and they occur quite often in Vietnam, of going out into the jungle, having a poo, and then disorientating yourself and walking back in through another area, like another machine gun area, or another troop that's sitting there with his, and he doesn't know you're coming, he thinks it's an enemy and shoots you. Many a man has died soon after going to the toilet. So I used to walk straight out in front of the machine gun and I'd stand there while Caesar did business and come back in again. Now, he knew that that was his function. That's what he had to do. He was not to crap inside where we were, just as we didn't. But one night, pitch black in the jungle, because it's always pitch black in the jungle, like a coal pit. I woke up and the dog was gone. He was not attached to my leg, he disappeared. And I immediately flew into a panic because I thought if he's wandered outside and comes back in, they're going to shoot him. And I'm feeling around and like you can actually feel the blackness, it's that black. And I heard this sound coming behind me and a hand on my shoulder and said, "Peter, is that you?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "We've got Caesar here." I said, "What was he doing?" He said, "Well, he came over to the machine gun, walked out the front and had a crap and walked back in again." I grabbed him and tied him back on my wrist. "Don't you ever bloody do that again." And he was actually doing what he was supposed to do, you know. It scared the suitcases out of me. We had funny things happening to us. I mean, we had our little adventures. Dennis and I, Marcus and Caesar, we were situated on a American base called Long Bin. Long Bin is about the size of Adelaide City. It was that huge, a military complex. And we were actually stationed there because Australian troops were operating to the north, and if we got called, we would be flown from there by the helicopter out there. And when I arrived at Long Bin, I arrived on one chopper, and Dennis and his dog were on another. And I jumped off with the dog. And this American major, or colonel, he just came striding up to me. And he said, "We've been waiting for you. You are going to be put in charge of bringing the helicopters in and sending the helicopters out at the resupply depot." Now, I knew what that involved. What it involved was actually holding the radio set, and as the helicopters were coming, you'd say, "Clear to land, taking off." Next one, "Clear to land, taking off." You were actually an air controller. And anybody could do that job if they knew correct radio procedure, and I was a trained radio man. However, I was a tracker, and he thought that the dog was my pet. And he said, "You're on the radio." I said, "I can't, I'm a tracker." He said, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm Australian." He said, "Well, you're going over and you're going to bring in the choppers because you're the person we've been waiting for." I said, "No, I'm not." He said, "You are, get over there." So I went across to this helicopter lot, and there was an American guy there, and I said, "I'm replacing you, I think." I said, I'm not an air controller, but I can operate your 25 radio set and bring them in." He said, "Well, there'll be dozens of them coming, and you've got to make sure that the resupply is put on and they're sent out." I said, "But I'm a tracking dog handler. And this dog gets very funny around helicopters, and he'll get absolutely funnier around 20 helicopters." And I said, "Can you take the dog back and lock him in the hut?" And he said, "Oh, we're not allowed to put animals in the hut. We can't do that." I said, "Well, I'm stuck with this dog, and I'm going to have real problems." He said, "Well, I've got to go to the crapper." He said, "I'll see you later." And he walked off and left me. Next minute, the radio is starting to buzz. You know, it was like black dog inbound. I knew these helicopters were coming. And they were American resupply choppers. And they were being loaded by people on the other side of the loading area to take supplies out to the Australians. And they thought that I was the forward air controller or the air controller for these helicopters. It was just one of those mad, stupid Vietnam moments. It should never happen, and that they just happened. So I tied Caesar up to the pack, and I put my rifle around it, and I put it next to me, and I just said, "Look, we're stuck with this, and I know what you're like. Please, please don't play up when these helicopters come in. Please don't do it, because there's going to be at least 20 coming. Just for me, don't do it anymore. Just stay where you are." Anyway, next minute the helicopters are coming in, and I'm on the phone, I'm on the radio, and I'm telling them one in next one coming in, going out, and there was sand and dirt and grit flying everywhere, and this confusion of noise. It was overwhelming. And next minute it was dead silence, and they were all gone. And I looked down, and Caesar was just lying there. He hadn't moved. And he just looked at me, and it was like, you know, if you'd have asked me ages ago, I wouldn't have jumped after choppers. It's just you never asked me. So we were there for a few more days, and I had that job for a couple more days, and we were going out, and Dennis said to me, "Look, why don't we take the dogs for a swim?" And I said, what's it all about? He said, there's a huge swimming pool here, over there, behind those bunkers. I went and had a look, and it was about, pardon me, it was about 30 feet long, 20 feet wide, beautiful, clear, chlorinated water. And nobody was using it, because everyone was off the base. So that night we brought the dogs over, and we kicked them both in. And it was the first swim that they'd had in Vietnam. And they swam from one end to the other, and they chased each other. And what Marcus's favourite stunt was to go racing along next to the water, and he would do a flying bomb, which would carry him 20 feet into the air, then he'd bomb. He was a Labrador, water mad dog, and Caesar loved it too. And we were swinging back and forward, and these dogs are playing, and next minute I hear the scream from the side of the pool. What the hell are you doing in there? I looked up, and it was this major that had given me the job on the radio. And I said, well, we're swimming. And he was looking at me, and his head was sort of shaking, and he couldn't speak. And a moment later, this flying furball went flying past him, and Marcus doing one of his flying bombs, splash straight into the water again. And I said, oh, we're actually trackers with the task force, and we're going tomorrow. And he just kept looking at us and shaking. His face was so red, I thought he was going to explode. And he called up this other guy, and he said, Sergeant, make a report on this. And he walked away. So I got out, and I said to him, you know, look, I'm really sorry, you know, I know it isn't good having the dogs in the swimming pool. It's a bit unhealthy, but we're going to show off tomorrow anyway. He said, buddy, he said, that's not our swimming pool. He said, that's our drinking water. So next day we shoved off. We didn't get into any more trouble. The dogs had a great time. They loved it.
So Caesar had been the cause of countless irritations for you, but was there any bond there that wasn't?
Yeah, well, when I say constant irritations, I do mean that. When two people are together, they're like a married couple for 12 months in a war zone. So if you had two men together, eventually they start to get sick of each other like a married couple, and they start to argue and bitch and moan and carry on. You know, you've got more than me. You're getting more sleep than me, and why are you always whinging? You know, that sort of carry on between two men, that always occurs, particularly among Australians. But they remain absolutely the best of mates, and they're bonded together. Their friendships forged under fire, and that's why you know, in wars men fight for each other. They don't fight for king and country. They fight for each other because all they have is each other. And it was the same relationship with Caesar and I. You know, we got on each other's nerves, and but other times we sort of hugged each other. And some of the most tender moments that I had with the dog, and Dennis as well, was when we were back at Nui Dat. We could actually let them out of their runs, and they could run. And they had this whole rubber plantation to run through. And they would just take off like a couple of missiles and chase each other and roll over each other, and you know, and then they come back with their tongues hanging out, just like your ordinary pet dog. They'd been given the run for the day. When we were out on operations, they were constantly on a lead, or they were tied up to some pole somewhere while we were filling sandbags. And the dogs were actually, they were just a digger with four legs. That's all they were, really. They couldn't speak, but we communicated with each other in other ways. And we never actually had big fallouts or anything like that. We had to do obedience with them to keep that alpha dog thing up, to make sure that we were the boss. And when we told them to do things, they did it. So we did obedience back at Nui Dat every day when we could.
What would that involve?
Just taking them out on a short lead, like a person would do with an obedience. Sit, stay, come, stop, down, all that sort of basic thing, and just keep doing it repetitively. Like a drill for the soldier. It was the dog's drill, was his obedience. We couldn't practice tracking because the area was too limited, and there was too much of a confusion of smells here. So we couldn't work on the tracking thing, which was what we would like to have done. So when the tracks did occur and we tracked, it was always the real thing. And, you know, we hoped that the dogs had it right. And they did. To my knowledge, the tracking dogs in Vietnam saved a lot of lives. I think they did. Because they stopped us walking into the enemy. there were 11 dogs in Vietnam. One of them died, as I said before. 10 of them went right through to the end of the war, and they survived. And during that course of time, which was from 1967 to 1972, they spent more time in the war zone than any soldier did. And they weren't thanked for it, because they never got any medals, and they were abandoned there when we came home, which was a very sad situation, and not many people knew about that until we sort of got the word out that, hey, listen, after the Vietnam War, you're sort of forgetting these dogs that went over there, and they were press ganged into the army, I think, really. They weren't recruited. And they gave everything, and they asked for nothing, really. And they were exposed to some horrendous situations, from Asian diseases right the way through to enemy fire. So, you asked before whether you thought the dogs knew they were in combat. I think they knew they were in combat, but I don't think they had a realisation of death, and they didn't have a realisation of good and evil, if there's such a thing, or the good side and the bad side, of the friendlies and the not-so-friendlies, Allied troops and Viet Cong. They may have discerned that the Asian smell was different to a Caucasian smell. So they may have interpreted the fact that Asian smell was synonymous with tracking and pointing, whereas the Caucasian smell was friendly food, comfort, and so on. Maybe they had that sort of interpretation on things. But they were a non-aggressive dog, so they weren't trained to attack or chase somebody and attack them. It's an interesting concept when you think about it, how dogs feel about the good and evil, in war that we... But I think basically they were soldiers. They just did a soldier's job.
How did the men feel about these dogs, these tracker dogs, the men from the platoons and units that you go out to help?
Well, as I said before, they saw the dog really, and I only knew this after I came home and I was told, that they saw the Labradors as a little pool of normality in a situation that was totally abnormal, the war. So to them, Caesar, Marcus, Tiber, Juno, Janus, all the other dogs that we had, were a little bit of Australia. A dog. Probably Caesar stood out a bit more because he looked kelpie. So he looked like an Australian larrikin kelpie. Marcus would lick you to death. The other dogs were also mixed breed, but they like, you looked at them and immediately you thought of home. And I've got a dog at home, or the family's got a dog at home, and here's an Australian dog. So it had a sort of a normality about all this war that was occurring around you all the time, where there's machinery and firepower and, basically things that were just abnormal and found in a war zone. I think that was the way they felt about them. They also saw them as a tracking dog, somebody who's going to follow the enemy and will follow the enemy and will have a contact. So the dog hopefully will do his job and won't lead us into real strife.
Did you ever come across those who were non-believers and refused to believe the dog's word? Or the dog's signal?
There were many Australian platoon commanders and company commanders and so on in Vietnam during the period of the 7 to 8 years that the dogs were involved, who would not use tracking dogs because they did not trust them, and they believed that they just didn't feel that they wanted to call the dogs out to the contact because it compromised certain operations, and if the dog failed and wasn't tracking and went off into the bush and wasn't tracking, find anybody, we're going to have a lot of problems. We've got to get everybody back again. So they were seen by many non-believers as not effective, whereas others saw them as being effective and working well.
How did you see them working?
I think they were 50% effective. I had tracks that led nowhere. For a variety of reasons, we didn't find the enemy. We got into an area where there's a population, or we came to a bunker system where the enemy had been before and had since gone on, or we reached situations where we couldn't track any further because we did not have artillery cover. Australian troops could not move through an area, operate within an area, unless they had artillery cover. So if they had a contact, they could call on artillery or big guns to support them. And quite often, it occurred to me twice, and other tracks were tracked to the boundary where we couldn't track any further and we had to fall back. As I said earlier, these dogs the tracking teams were designed for a guerrilla-style warfare, which was the way that Vietnam started off. But it became a conventional sort of warfare. So tracking was virtually unnecessary because you were immediately going to walk into the enemy because there were so many there. And they were looking for you as much as you were looking for them. In a conventional style warfare, you did not need a tracking dog because you weren't following anybody. You were advancing to contact what was going to occur instead of pursuit.
You'd mentioned that your physical appearance had changed and that this constant high tension and stress environment, being ready for anything to go wrong at any moment, had actually physically changed you. You looked different. Did the men around you look different?
Yes. Yeah, yeah they did. There were a variety of diseases in Vietnam. There was, probably one of the worst was malaria. And we had malaria preventatives, tablets and so on and so forth. But a lot of people got malaria, which could be pretty fatal. There were so many other type of diseases associated with poisonings that gave you constant diarrhea and things like that. So your body was actually ravaged by the elements. No wars are ever fought in a good environment. It just doesn't happen that way. You could be fighting in the snow and freeze to death. You will never go to an environment where you can have a good, nice, friendly, environmentally friendly war. The same, in Iraq, where you had sandstorms. I mean, I've never been in a sandstorm like they had in Iraq, but I can imagine what it's like trying to be a soldier in a sandstorm. Quite apart from the fact your equipment was full with sand, you'd drive you mad. The environment in Vietnam, if you're a tourist, is probably quite nice. You have lovely monsoonal downpours 3 or 4 times a day. You have a dry season when it's warm, you can lie around and probably even get a tan. But when it comes to hostilities in a war environment, you've got to carry your water, you've got your patrolling out, looking for the enemy, you're eating basically rations out of cans or dehydrated stuff. Once a week, if you were lucky, you'd get a fresh meal delivered to you. The tour of Vietnam was 365 days. As opposed to other wars before Korea, there was no tour of duty. Soldiers went overseas and they're over there for a few years and they're on the front line for a period of time, and they'd come back into a back secure area and spend time there or be relocated elsewhere, then advance to contact again, maybe for a period of time. Whereas Vietnam was intensely, during that 12 months, full-on war for the combatant. Some out of the 365 days spent more than 340 actually in the jungle, patrolling and fighting. And at the end of that period of 12 months, you were flown out of Vietnam back home, and you were told, your war's finished now, you can go back to your job. By the time the combatant was ready to come home, he was really ready to come home, and he had probably been sick. He lost weight. Psychologically, he was in a bad way, but he was going to get worse. Many were carrying Asian tinnias, tropical ulcers, all those sort of things that were peculiar to jungle warfare. And to be removed from that situation, to be put on an aircraft and flown home within a number of hours and arrive back in Australia, get off the aircraft and be back with a family or whatever, it was an enormous dislocation. When I arrived back from Vietnam after my first tour, of course I left from Brisbane, the battalion came from Brisbane, I lived in Adelaide. We arrived back in Brisbane and there was a sort of a crowd. We had a sort of a march through the streets and got clapped. I got on a plane and I flew down to Adelaide and I got off at the airport. There was nobody here to meet me. I got home and my mother and father were in bed asleep. That was the way I came home from the war, because nobody told them that I was coming home, because there may have been protests, so it was kept fairly well unwrapped. Many diggers crept home not through their choice, like thieves in the night, and that was the way they came home from the war. We still had parades through the streets and we still got clapped, but that sort of gradually changed in 71 and 72, because support for the war had dropped and finished. So when I went back for my second tour of duty, the whole tone of the war had changed. My attitude had changed because I didn't have a full belief and commitment in it anymore. I was actually serving out my time because I was in for 6 years, and I had no choice about going back a second time. But the intensity of the war had not changed. It was still full on, and you were still going to get killed as readily as you were back in 1967.
So you and the other men had changed, and you were coming home and probably going to experience more change. Had the animals changed?
Well, the animals stayed there.
But during that first tour, had they degraded at all in health or
yes, I see what you mean. I felt that when I left, Caesar was a lot more quiet and reserved. Sometimes he wasn't his playful self like he used to be. He'd lost a bit of weight. A couple of the other dogs, later on, not necessarily when I left, but certainly later on, they contracted some pretty awful Asian diseases. The vet care for those dogs was first class. It was taken care of by American vets, and we would go down to the port of Vung Tau or into Saigon once a month, and they would be checked by American vets and given their needles. The dogs were actually injected with a live rabies vaccine when they left Australia. So they could never go back to Australia without going through a quarantine period because they had rabies. They actually carried the rabies vaccine inside them. That was one of the reasons they couldn't go back, because of that particular quarantine situation. And they were really cared for and given all the proper care. They were never mistreated, and they were really actually loved. So the only knocking around they got was from the war itself. And they were there for a long time. Whether they were going out on combat missions, whether they were actually on patrols, or whether they were based in Nui Dat. Caesar, well, Marcus was pretty well on duty for 5 years. Caesar was about 3.5, 4. And I think Tiber, the one that got there early on as well, he was there for 4 years. And up until the Australians left, 2 dogs were still being used, to my knowledge, on tracking missions. So it was quite it was an interesting aspect of the Vietnam War, the war dogs.
Can you tell me about the work you were involved in towards the end of your 12 months, when it was scaling down? What was the what were the kind of things that people were expecting the trackers to do?
Well, still tracking. We were still called out to do tracking, but basically we'd spend our times on fire support bases, sitting there waiting to be called out by patrols who were involved in contacts. But they were becoming fewer and far between after the Big Tet offensive of 67, 68. That was the Tet New Year. So on the January the 1st, January the 2nd, which is the Chinese New Year, the enemy launched attacks on every major military base in South Vietnam, plus every city, at the same time. And the whole of Vietnam seemed to be on fire. It was a massive, massive battle. There were full-on battles, tank battles, the whole bit. And the enemy were basically defeated. They lost thousands and thousands. The Allies lost a lot too. But the enemy were basically defeated. They thought that if they did this, that the local population of South Vietnam would swing into their favour and support a full revolution. It didn't happen. They were defeated. But the images were so horrific, and they were shown on every TV, in every TV lounge room in America and Australia, that the general population said enough is enough. We're not going to win this war. It's time for a withdrawal. That was in early '68. But it took a couple of years for the momentum, anti-war momentum, to build up.
How were you feeling about these images, Peter? You must have been seeing them. They went on TV for you. These were images around you.
Yeah.
How were you reconciling that?
No, I wasn't reconciling it. It was pretty well. I thought it was pretty well standard warfare. We were not involved in the major street battles like the Americans were in South Vietnam during that Tet Offensive. We had a couple of big ones in the towns in Phuoc Tuy. But I was not involved in them because I was with the tracking unit. But they were big and they were rough and they were rugged and there were lots of bodies and it was pretty horrific. Street by street fighting, which was certainly a long, long way from guerrilla warfare. The Australians acquitted themselves very well. Lost quite a few men. I mean, really did lost during that Tet Offensive. But as a result of that, the province, Phuoc Tuy province, which we were responsible for, was made quite secure, and we were ready to move ahead and feeling fairly sort of upbeat about the fact that the war's going our way. And it was going our way, but we lost the public support. Well, the soldiers didn't, but the governments did. Lost the public support, which meant that troops were withdrawn from Vietnam. And as the troops were withdrawn, we still had the same area of responsibility and had to carry out the same job with fewer people. And it became very, very hard in 1971. So when I went back in '71, it was a much, much harder war. And we had less people to fight it with, and we had less equipment, we had less support, and we did not have the support of the public.
The difficult portions of war, facing the enemy and facing death on a regular basis, must give you a pretty strange idea of what the enemy is. How were you feeling about the enemy? It seems like an odd question, but how were your perceptions of the enemy? What did you feel about these people?
The Australian, my belief, how I felt and how I believed other soldiers felt about the enemy. I've been asked this quite a few times, and about killing enemy. Our general attitude was total indifference and no respect for him. Didn't hate him. Had no hate for the Viet Cong or the NVA. They were soldiers or guerrilla fighters, and they were fighting for communism and communism domination. And we were trying to keep them out, and we were killing each other doing it. Whoever was the best player was going to win on the day. That was the way it was going to be. The idea was to kill him before he kills me. I regret a loss of life and the fact that young men died and the rest of it. But I felt totally comfortable with going to Vietnam, killing Viet Cong, because that was my job as a soldier, was to find him and kill him, unless he gave up. If he gave up and surrendered, he'd be taken and treated properly. At no time in Vietnam did I ever witness atrocities. I never saw Australians carry out atrocities. I never heard of Australians carrying out atrocities. I heard of it happening with Americans, and I believe that the Mile A thing occurred. But the Australian soldier, both the national serviceman and the regular soldier's attitude towards his war service and his actions during his war service, I always thought was totally professional. Got very, very upsetting when mates died, and that may have caused a rage. Of course, it would have caused a rage. That was basically taken out on the enemy, but actually hate. There was no hate in that sense of the word for the South the Vietnamese Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese Army. They, as far as I'm concerned, committed atrocities. I think they did. I never saw it, never saw any, but I know other guys did. And towards the end of my first tour of Vietnam and at the end of the second one, I was still quite happy to go out into a contact and firefight and shoot the enemy or bomb him or some way neutralise him. We took quite a few into captivity.
Did you personally take POWs?
No, did not. But we had them come into where we were and saw them blindfolded and their hands tied. And I always saw them as being treated properly, always. Given cigarettes and water and everything else, and then disposed of back to the proper authorities. What happened after then, I don't know. But as far as I'm concerned, the Australians' performance in Vietnam was absolutely professional and was always correct and of the totally highest standard that a soldier could have. The Australian soldiers that went to Vietnam were the best trained, best equipped soldiers that had ever gone to a war to that time. And the national serviceman was as professional as the regular, and you would not have known the difference. Shy-act with each other, slung off at each other, had a go at each other, but when it came down to diggers, there was no difference. They were just terrific. Well, we never looked at each other as us and them. We did in Australia, because it was part of larrikinism, really. But when it came to the war, there was not an us and them. It was just us.
Were the national servicemen as good as the regular army?
Oh, absolutely. We were trained the same way. We were trained the same way. We were given the same length of training and equipped the same way. And we went into a combat situation as one cohesive group. So you're sitting there, I'm here, you're Nasho, I'm regular, we're still doing the same sort of thing, and we'll still help each other. And there was never any apparent resentment by a national serviceman towards a regular soldier, because to my way of thinking, and you know, I don't know whether it's true or not, every national serviceman that was in Vietnam was quite wanted to be there, wanted to be part of it, for the Australian digger excitement thing. You know, it was all part of the legacy of the Anzac and the rest of it. And and a lot of them whinged the whole way through the war, and still, you know, they were quite happy about it. Yeah.
You mentioned the fire bases. They weren't real pleasant places to be. What was the worst one that you had to spend time at? What sticks in your mind?
They were all awful. Everyone. A fire base or a fire support base or fire support patrol base, as they were called. The concept was to actually establish them so that the range of the guns, the artillery support, could support the infantry. So the infantry, the battalions, could range further and further out into the province. Whereas the range of an artillery piece, I think, is about 5,000 metres. I could be wrong on that. The fire support base could be established 5,000 or 10,000 metres from Nui Dat, the task force headquarters. So in other words, a battalion going out of Nui Dat could go 15,000 metres out. That was basically the concept. It also, the big guns were there to support infantry in event of a contact. They were there to what was called H&I, harass and indict the enemy. that means that any time of the night these big guns would fire up and they would drop a salvo of rounds anywhere in the jungle at night, as long as it wasn't near the friendlies. So the Viet Cong or the enemy had to keep moving, otherwise they could just be hit by a sudden salvo of shells that came down. It involved usually involved three artillery pieces and a command centre, all sandbagged in, and then a detachment of infantry would lay barbed wire all the way around them. So it was some of them were the size of a football field, others were half the size of a football field probably. Quite often armoured personnel carriers would also be in there as added defence, or they could roll out on a contact and carry men out to a contact if a contact was big. But basically a life on a fire support base was in the dry season was clouds of red dust, and in the wet season it was just rivers of red mud. You lived basically in a hole in the ground.
There's a fire support place called Bearcat, I think you mentioned in your book, or?
Well, no, Bearcat was a base, a permanent base. Yeah. The fire support bases were temporary. They could be there for just a few days or a few months.
What was Bearcat like?
Bearcat was a permanent American base of permanent structures that were sandbagged, and it had an airfield. And my recollections of it was that it had an airfield, and it had permanent defences and towers set up and all sorts of things. It was a permanent base.
Were you ever on a fire support base when it was attacked?
During the Tet Offensive, I was on fire support base Anderson, and Anderson and another fire support base called Harrison were actually supporting the Australian troops who had been deployed out of Phuoc Tuy province into Long Khan province to prevent the withdrawal of enemy troops who had been attacking Saigon. So you had North Vietnamese army and Viet Cong by their thousands retreating away, and the Australians had set in a blocking force. That was why it was a major, major operation. It was called Coburg. On Anderson, we had artillery pieces, and we moved in. It had been previously American. We moved in and we tidied it all up and strengthened the defences and so on. And during the night of the beginning of the Tet Offensive, we could actually see Saigon, Long Ben complexes in the distance actually being hit. It was lit up like a fireworks, Guy Fawkes night. And we were in a bunker, and I was in the bunker with Caesar, and we were with a couple of other guys behind a machine gun. And we thought that we were being probed, that enemy were actually coming back, and we were in their way, and they were going to have a dig at us, and the big guns fired up, and we basically shot at a lot of things that night. We never found any bodies in the morning, just a few remains of bodies. About 2 days later, I was with the 2nd Battalion. We were withdrawn from that base, and we went back to Nui Dat by road, and the 3rd Battalion moved in. And the day after it moved in, it had a full ground assault on it. So I missed out on that by 1 day. Other fire support bases I was on were probed, and we just opened fire, but we were never had an assault. The two major fire support bases involving Australians in Vietnam that were really assaulted were Coral and Balmoral.
Anderson, how did it get named?
Our fire support bases were named after the wives, usually, of officers in the battalion. Julie, Sheila, Brenda, all those sort of things. Others were given different names.
She said you didn't come across civilian casualties, but you were involved in the search of villages. And how were the civilians treated during those searches, in your opinion?
Village searches were the subject of what was... the small villages in Phuoc Tuy were the subject, very often, all of them, were subjected to what was called a cordon search. Percentages of villages in certain villages supported the enemy and supported the Viet Cong and supplied them with rations, food and ammunition. And it was hoarded and cached within those villages. Some of them were bad, and they were always going to be Viet Cong sympathetic. Others were Australian, pro-Australian, and didn't have that sort of problem. So a cordon search involved a battalion moving in at night and surrounding a village without anybody knowing. It's supposed to be secret. And then in the morning, at first light, soldiers would move in with Vietnamese interpreters, civil aid people, military advisors and so on, and they would actually conduct the search while the infantry maintained the cordon or actually went in and physically searched buildings, looking for tunnels, looking for bunkers, looking for huge amounts of rice that shouldn't be there, looking for ammunitions that were actually hidden underneath huchis and villages and huts and so on. The populations were resentful. They didn't like it one little bit because they were turfed out of their house for a few hours while they were searched. They were asked to produce identity. They were often looking for draft dodgers. That was South Vietnamese who had dodged military draft. Some village searches turned nasty where Booby traps were involved. Or there were actually Viet Cong in there trying to get out.
Were you involved in any of those searches that turned nasty?
No, I wasn't. No. I was in a cordon search. On the second tour, I was in a cordon search of a village that gave us a lot of problems called Hua Long. And there were Viet Cong in there while we were doing it. And they made a run for it. And as a result, there was a firefight, you know, while they were trying to break through the cordon. That was probably the only one that I remember where there was an incident involved. But I only went in on a couple because being a tracking element, we were maintained for other type duties. They were very, very effective from what I was told, village searches. They had to be done.
You had a machine gunner with you called Thatcher, was it? Or?
Yeah. Bruce Thatcher was a national serviceman. He was from the Northern Territory, and he was a real country boy. He was one of those guys who was a larrikin national serviceman and hung around with 2 or 3 others, and we used to stir each other up. But he was a machine gunner that was attached to the tracking team, and he used to walk behind the dog handler or the visual tracker with the machine gun. I maintained friendship with him over the years, and we still go to reunions together. He is now permanently retired or permanently TPI. He injured his back and he suffered some post-traumatic stress disorder as well and became TPI. About 80% of the servicemen that I've served with in Vietnam are now TPI. I'm one of the few people still working. I've always taken the sort of attitude that I suffered post-traumatic stress disorder quite seriously, quite many years after the war, and I was determined that I wasn't sort of going to give into it. I was going to handle it, you know, and I'd continue to work, and I have continued to work. But it seems, unfortunately, that as you get older, and the distance between your life and the war becomes greater, the seriousness of PTI becomes more intense. I've found that I have a lot more troubles now than I had as a younger man when I came out of the services. For many years, for about 10 to 15 to 20 years even, there was a massive Vietnam amnesia where nobody talked or thought about it at all. And then the PTSD started. And for some psychological reason, it comes in up to 10 years after the event. I've spoken to many people about this. I've spoken to doctors and psychs about it. I've read books on it and so on. And I think even now we're only beginning to come to grips with post-traumatic stress disorder in relation to all events that occur. I mean, it's not restricted to war. People who were in Bali will have problems 10 years down the line, very serious problems. Those that were in train wrecks and train disasters, 5 to 10 years after, PTSD comes in. It's unresolved anger, bitterness, trauma relating to the event that never gets put away into the back of the brain. It stays up front. And what's called stresses that that pertain to it occasionally get hit on you all the time. So there are certain stresses that I've got that will be touched that cause a PTSD reaction.
What do you flash back to then? What particular incidents?
I dealt with the first tour of Vietnam quite well. I had what you might call a normal war experience. But going back the second time, there were quite a few incidents that occurred in that second tour that led to that I found very traumatic. We had leadership problems, and also people were dying unnecessarily because it was winding down and it was nearly finished. But basically, it was equated with poor leadership. Going back as a veteran to the war a second time, you have all the benefit of what you saw occurring previously. But you're going back with a lot of people who are going there for the first time, and to try and impart the knowledge that you've got to them is very, very difficult, particularly at the senior level, officer type level on that. Look, don't do this, don't do that, this is not the way to do it, that's the way to do it, and so on. And these messages are ignored, and you're going over dead ground again. That was the traumatising thing that I found.
Just perhaps staying on your the more broader impressions. We'll come to some of those perhaps later, and certainly it's very important for us to talk about that from the archives point of view. But I'd like to sort of go over some of the perhaps more colourful things. You mentioned rock and roll music. Was that still part of the war, the Australians' war experience, and the sounds of the war for you?
Yeah, the Vietnam War was often referred to as a rock and roll Coca-Cola type war. I mean, we didn't have the American experience, which you could fill volumes with.
What was your experience though of it?
Yeah. The Australians weren't dope smokers and didn't get high on dope. They drank until they were drunk. The music that we had in 1968 was via Armed Forces American radio. On the second tour, the Australians had set up their own radio station, so we had our own rock and roll music plus country music, and requests, and an AFL football broadcast, and the broadcast of the Melbourne Cup. We'd get that sort of thing.
What song takes you back to the Vietnam War when you?
Creedence Clearwater Revival's music is equated with the war, really. I got all of their particular albums, like The Fortunate Son, Green River, Heard It Through the Grapevine, all that sort of music. The CCR music was really quite strong. The one song that everybody equates with Vietnam is the music from The Deer Hunter, which was Can't Take My Eyes Off You, Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. Of course, it was in the Deer Hunter film, but it was also thrashed to death on radio over there. Lonely Soldier, crikey, Bobby Vinton, I think, that was thrashed and thrashed and thrashed to death. Then, as time progressed, you had music from The Fifth Dimension, Up and Away, Age of Aquarius, and that sort of thing. When we got to 1971, soldiers used to go on R&R and they'd buy thousands of dollars worth of stereo equipment. And the equipment that we were buying in Singapore and Hong Kong, where we went for R&R for our 7 days, was state-of-the-art stuff, years ahead of what they're having in Australia. Reel-to-reel tapes, Acai's, huge, massive sound systems. And they bought it on R&R and they'd bring it back and put it in the tent and sandbag it into the walls of the tent with massive speakers. They were going 40 to 60 watt speakers. And others would go out and buy, I had a turntable, which was a commercial turntable, Pioneer commercial turntable. I brought that back with me, plus the whole set of speakers and a sound Sui amplifier, and piles of albums, records, the real thing. And I'd play those and guys would record it and then they'd go and play it off down at their tents. So at night you'd have a battle of the sounds in these tents. You'd have Rolling Stones at one end, CCR at the other, and then somebody else would be doing Slim Dusty. It was that sort of cross-section of music. On Armed Forces Radio, you'd have request music, And it was basically any sort of rock that was going in that time. But the music evolved from 1967 through to 1971. The journey of rock and roll music was actually the journey of Vietnam. You know, so when I got home after my first tour, Sgt. Pepper, the album was out. I'd bought stacks of Beach Boys stuff because I used to love Beach Boys type music. And I had all the Beatle type music as well. I got all Rolling Stones that I could actually collect. The tastes in music among Australians was very, very wide. Among the Americans, if you went onto an American base or you listened to their armed forces radio, you started to see like the Summer of Love 1968 and the hippie type music, and then a bit of acid rock. I think that's right. That was starting to come in, but they also were really on R&B and blues.
Can you
Dock of the Bay was a song that you'd hear 50 times a day, along with Respect by Aretha Franklin. You would hear that 50 times a day.
Can you paint us illustrate a typical R&R trip for you with a story that you remember?
Well, to many soldiers, like a 19 or 20-year-old, R&R was just a blur. I mean, we're drunk most of the time. Every soldier was entitled to 7 days of R&R and 5 days of R&C. R&C was rest and convalescence in country, and that was always taken at Vung Tau. And in the later years, a club was built down there called the Peter Badcoe Club. It had a swimming pool, and basically you hung out down there. When swimming, you could go into the sea or go into the street of bars in Vung Tau. On R&R, you were on the tours that I were on, you were able to go to Hong Kong, Singapore, Taipei, Bangkok. In later years, you could come back to Australia, or Penang.
Where did you go?
I went to Hong Kong.
Did Caesar run around and wag his tail and go nuts when he saw you again, or is it?
Dennis looked after him when I went away, and I looked after him and Marcus when he went away. We had a system working where if I was crook, or sometimes I was given other duties away from dog handling, he would look after both dogs. But under the orders that were all those dogs had to be looked after every day. They had to be walked if they were Nui Dat, and they had to be fed fresh meat at Nui Dat every day, and they had to be given some form of obedience, so that the dog was very much an asset and treated like an asset. So they were always looked after there always had to be one handler.
Did you ever come under the attention of any news cameraman or journalist while you were out with the dogs?
Yeah, I was doing a track, doing a track, and I thought I was tracking the enemy, and a Korean cameraman stepped out in front of me. He'd actually got around in front, stepped out in front of me with his camera on his shoulder, photographing me coming down the track tracking, and he nearly died. He very nearly died.
Why didn't you shoot him?
I don't know. It was just a second that stopped me, because I thought it was an enemy firing a rocket launcher at me. He had one of those early model cameras that the news media had, was like a wind-up one with film in it.
Bell and Howell.
Yeah. And he had it up here, and I thought it was for a split second I thought it was an enemy with a rocket launcher. And I was bringing the rifle up when he dropped it and smiled at me. That was a setup, because we were with Americans doing that track, and we were hanging around a long time before we got going. And I believe it was because they had organised a setup of actually action filming with soldiers coming towards you, which is an unusual aspect. To get soldiers advancing to you, your camera is quite unusual. Usually you're behind them as they move forward. And he somehow got into it. He got a semicircle and got onto that track in front of me. And I was tracking along the track, and I was ready for a contact. And he stepped down and started filming.
What did Caesar do?
Caesar jerked back. I mean, I suppose he should have pointed. Maybe he did point, but it was a very unusual sort of day. Everything about it was wrong, and he didn't seem to want to track. He just didn't seem to want to track. and I had to urge him on. So he was doing it half-heartedly. So I didn't get a point. I got angry at him because he didn't point. But as it turned out, he was... I don't know what would have happened if he'd have pointed. Of course, Bob was behind me as a cover man, and he may have just moved straight forward and fired. Yeah, that was the only time I ever saw a war correspondent or a war person there. They never came out with us. I never saw them on any fire support bases, Australians otherwise, and I never saw any correspondence in the field. Yeah, that was just that one occasion. Mm.
Can you take us through a helicopter insertion? And
a helicopter insertion. The Vietnam War was basically about air mobility. It was the helicopter, the Iroquois in particular, or the Huey. It was called a Huey because its number designation was UH. So it was always called a Huey. We used American and we used Australian helicopters. If there was a big operation, the American helicopters were called in to carry troops. For smaller operations, the Australian, the IAAF 9 Squadron was used for actually ferrying troops around, providing gunship support and so on. The Huey helicopter should carry 7 men on the deck inside and sitting. Could carry 10. With Australians, it was usually 7 or 8, usually 7 because of all the equipment. When they carried South Vietnamese, they could usually get an extra 3 in. But that was usually the number, and they had 2 helicopter gunners sitting just slightly to the rear in special alcoves with M60 machine guns.
how are you sitting with your with Caesar? In this
if we were going out as a tracking team, that was different to a normal helicopter insertion. It was a tracking team insertion. So I would sit on the seat and Caesar would just sit on the floor. If we had other members, like Bob might be there, Bill, Les the coverman, and maybe one other would form that component. That was usually the tracking element that would go out. Those 4 guys and the dog.
Did you ever drop Caesar in from a winch?
Oh yes, yes.
Can you describe that for us?
The winch jacket I usually had parcelled up and strapped on top of my backpack, so it was easily accessible. If we were going into a winch insertion, we were usually told just before we took off or while we're in the air, we're going to have to insert by winch because we can't land. That means that the trees are too tall and there was no clearing. So lowering down men by winch is not a difficult situation, but in a war zone, you never knew where the enemy were, and they were going to be firing at you if you were swinging around in the air. And in the one contact that we went into, the enemy had been hit and ran off, and we were called, so we were going to be winched down to the Australian platoon, which was waiting on the ground for us, and they had secured the area as best they could, but the enemy were around. It was raining that particular day. It had been monsooning, and we were going to be lowered down in through the trees during the rain. So Simon, one of the covermen who was with us, a visual tracker, and I think Bob, they sat on the edge of the door while the helicopter hovered in the rain above the trees. And they had a sling passed around them, and they were pushed out, and then the button was depressed, and the gunner, who was also a crewman, just watched and jiggled and gave instructions to the pilot while he was lowering. Move forward 10, move back 10, move forward 8, move rear 8. So he was actually lowering the man down through the trees as best he could using the depression button. And it was steel cable, and it had a guillotine on it. And if the person became entangled in the trees and were fired on at the same time, he would fire the cable and break the cable, and the guy would just drop. Now, you always have that in the back of your mind, that you could be guillotined. I got the dog on, and I wrapped the harness around the dog, and I clipped on the winch hook, and then the crewman took the dog and just swung the dog out into the air on the winch arm. So he was actually 3 or 4 feet from it, just wobbling in the air. And he pressed the button, and the dog just went straight down.
What's Caesar doing?
He was actually like dog paddling in the air. That's all he did. He was quite happy about it. and he was well supported. I don't know what he actually thought, but he didn't panic. He never panicked. I went out and I got panicky because it was in the rain, and there was the colossal noise of the rotors going, and the trees were whipping back and forward. And I bounced off and hit one tree, and I bounced off and hit another, and the guy was very good. He just eventually got me down onto the ground. The pilots and the crew winching you down and pulling you up, particularly in relation to dust-off and wounded, was absolutely brilliant. They were just brilliant. There was a device called a jungle penetrator, and it was like a ship's anchor or a spear with the pieces folded in, and the crewman would send it straight down through the trees, and when it reached the ground, you'd open the spears out and they'd form a seat. Then you put the wounded man on the seat and strap him on and get him to hold on, and then the crewman would actually bring that guy up. It was brilliant stuff. You'd do it 3 or 4 times to bring wounded up.
Did you have to send out wounded like that when you were on patrol?
On one of the patrols I was on in the second tour, my forward scout collapsed with heat exhaustion. I thought it was heat stroke, and you've got to get him out straight away because there's every indication he'll die, particularly if it's heat stroke. And I called for the platoon commander called for the dust off. Now that was called medevac, as opposed to casevac. Casevac is the evacuation of casualties from a battle. Medevac is the medical evacuation of somebody who's sick, been stung by bees, broken his ankle, fractured his leg, or he's just got a violent vomiting fit. And my scout had what I suspected was heat stroke because he'd gone a really funny colour. It was very dry, and he couldn't move. And the chopper came over, and we couldn't put him on a Stokes litter, on the jungle penetrator. We used a Stokes litter, which is a long basket about 6 foot long, and that's lowered down, and you lay the person out and then winch them up. And he was actually sent up in that. Just and straight to hospital.
Back to that time when you were inserted with Caesar, what happened after that? Can you take us through that patrol? Do you remember that particular patrol?
Well, there were a lot of different insertions. The situation towards the end of my tour with the dog, we would go out as a team. It'd be myself and the dog, Bob, Bill, the cover man, and there'd be 4 of us. And we would go into the platoon, and we would form the nucleus of the tracking unit who was going to do the tracking. Towards the end, things became so fragmented and so loose, and after Tet, the intensity of the war cranked up quite dramatically, and people were given different jobs and tasks, and these guys were also section commanders. And the New Zealanders, we were working with New Zealanders at that time that was attached to our battalion. We were the 1st Anzac Battalion in Vietnam, because we were an Australian battalion with an Anzac attachment, which was a rifle company called Victor. And they were all New Zealanders, and they came from Malaya to Vietnam to join us. So we were the 1st Anzac Battalion. Subsequent battalions during the next years in Vietnam were also Anzac battalions, and all had attached a New Zealand rifle company. The New Zealanders were all regulars. There was no national servicemen, and they were really hard men. And a lot of them were Maoris, and they were really hard, aggressive men. And they used tracking dogs quite a bit.
You went out with them?
Yeah, but I didn't go out with the rest of my unit, other trackers, because there wasn't an Iroquois helicopter available, so I had to get on a Sioux. And it would only take myself and the dog and the pilot flying it. It was a plastic bubble with just an engine on the back. It was like a sewing machine. And I had to get in that bubble with the dog and all my equipment, and we were going to be flown to the New Zealanders. And it was just going to be me and the dog to do the tracking without the assistance of a coverman or any support at all. And that was pretty late on in the tour. And by that time, I was pretty shagged. I was really running on empty. And we went out in a damn storm and got flown in. And the helicopter pilot that took us out was all over the place because he was scared he was going to get hit by a rocket. So he went left and right on his cyclic was there and everywhere. And he was just across the top of the trees. I was just so violently ill. I just felt so violently ill with, of course, you're looking through this glass bubble, and the whole world's flashing by. And Caesar's looking out there. He just loved it. He thought it was fantastic. This ride in this chopper was just because he could see everything. And we got there, and I stumbled out into the trees, and there were 3 dead VC there. They'd been killed by the forward scout. And the Kiwis, they had peculiar ways of going about things, very aggressive, gung-ho, but superb professional soldiers. And they said, look, it doesn't matter, you come in here with your dog, we're going to support you, we were right behind you, let's get going. And away we went into the mud, tracking these Viet Cong. And it just went on and on and on, and I was feeling worse with each passing 10 to 100 metres. I felt I wanted to be sick, and the dog was still tracking, and I was looking at boot prints the whole way. We were on their track the whole way, and we ran straight into a wild pig haunt where there were dozens of wild pigs. And I could hear them. The dog pointed, but he actually looked very strange when he pointed. He had this sort of trembling about him. And all I could see was thick vegetation in the mud and the rain. And I thought the enemy are right behind there. They've got to be, because I could hear the sounds. So I told the New Zealanders, we're going to get hit any second. They're going to come out, and the bushes just parted, and these bodies flew at us. And this big Kiwi next to me pulled up his machine gun and just sprayed the whole area before becoming aware that we were being charged by these massive pigs. And bits of pig just exploded. There was guts flying through the air, feces were going everywhere. They were screaming, running in and out of us, and they had massive tusks. And I grabbed the dog. He threw me to one side as soon as he started firing, and I grabbed the dog and I held onto the dog because I thought he'd get disemboweled by one of these pigs, but more that the Kiwis would actually shoot him because he was black too, same as the pigs. And the pigs were running in and out of all the Kiwis, and the Kiwis were just shooting them. It was hysteria. It was just absolute hysteria, because we built up to a point where we anticipated a firefight. Any minute there was going to be a contact with the enemy, and instead we got attacked by pigs. And that was probably one of the worst incidents I had in that tour of Vietnam, because I felt so bad and everything was so wretched. Everything about the day was just terrible, and I was by myself with these strange guys, and I sort of was thinking and wishing that we'd just get into a contact and just clean everything up, and I might get wounded and get casevaced out. And I was getting to that. I was at a low point because I'd also had about 3 days of diarrhea, and I had no strength, and everything was relying on this dog. I was relying on everything on this dog. Had to do his job because I couldn't cope with it. And then we got attacked by pigs. And as they were coming at us and they were shot, they immediately defecated. And I was covered in pig shit. From top to bottom I was covered in pig shit. So were the Kiwis. All blood and entrails. And I had to go back to Nui Dat that night. I had to be picked up and taken back. And on the way back to Nui Dat, I was just covered in this stuff. And the dog was covered in it as well. And it started to harden. And got back to Nui Dat, we landed, and I got the dog off, and we walked down to the kennels. Kennels weren't far from the LZ. And I threw a bucket of water over him and pushed him into the run. And then I walked back towards the tent. I walked in the tent, and these guys nearly killed me. They told me that, to get out. You've got to get out. You can't come in here. The stink was unbelievable. So I went to the showers, and I got some boiling water. We had hot showers. We tipped them. We pulled it up and put it on, and I just showered myself with 3 buckets of hot water to get all this off. And I had a recollection of just sitting on the floor while the shower was on me, trying to get this stuff off. And Dennis went up to the kennels and actually hosed Caesar down, washed him down with soap water and hosed him down. That was unbelievable. That was just an unbelievable. It was, of course, the New Zealanders are pretty free and easy when they start firing. They just let everything go, and it was hitting these pigs. So it stirred them up, and more were coming out of this piggery or whatever it was, where it was a pig wallow, where pigs all hang around together in a big muddy pond. They were all there, and there must have been dozens. And the enemy went straight past. So we so we had a firefight with a lot of pigs.
Peter, we were talking off camera, and as always happens, we happened to uncover something that was really interesting to us. I was wondering if you could tell again us about running out of food and water and how that affected the men, what that was like and when that happened.
Well, yeah, on patrols, search and destroy missions, which is what they were sometimes called, each man would carry 5 to 6 days of rations. And at the end of those 5 or 6 days, he would be re-rationed with another 5 or 6 by Iroquois helicopter, which would come into a convenient clearing, and the ration packs would all be unloaded, and you'd get them and break them all up and split them, and get your sugar and your coffee and your pork and beans and sausage frankfurters, biscuits and sugar, and then you'd have your milk and little Vegemite packets of biscuits and all that sort of thing. And split them all up, break them up into parcels, and then pack them all into your backpack. Also, it's the same situation with water. Each man usually carried 6 water bottles on his belt and on his pack. And if the water was running low and you were due for a resupply of water, the Iroquois would come in and there would be water bottles full, pardon me, of water in Hessian sacks, and they'd be actually kicked off so you get your water resupply. During extreme conditions, the dry season was the bad season because there was no available water around the place. Streams, little ponds and those sort of things, where you could actually fill up and drop sterilising tablets in your bottle to sterilise the water. So in the dry season, water was a critical aspect of soldiering. The other thing was, if you were getting near the end of your ration time and suddenly you came into a hot zone and you were in contact with the enemy and there was enemy in the vicinity, resupply choppers wouldn't come in. So you could suddenly find yourself running out of food and water, and the next day you're still on pursuit of the enemy, or the enemy is still around and you weren't going to get a resup. And you'd start to get hungry. You'd have no food left, and your water would be critically low or no water. Men would pass their food around. They would pass water bottles around to try and make sure that everybody had a drink. And the other critical aspect was, without water, you'd have cases of heat stroke and heat exhaustion, and you couldn't eat food anyway if you didn't have any water. So all those things came into play, and it could become quite a dangerous time. To one of the tracks that we actually went on, we were pursuing the enemy in the dry season, and we'd already run low on rations, but we were still pursuing the enemy. We followed them for nearly all day, and they stayed ahead of us, and we couldn't catch them. And we kept having to drink because there was the physical exertion factor, as well as the fact that the sun was beating on you. You had to drink. And I kept giving Caesar his water, which I gave him in a steel mug, to try and get water into him, because he was a black dog. And the vegetation we were moving through on that particular operation was not high overhead jungle canopy. It was low bush. So we were exposed to the sun as well as doing the track and running out of water. And he was heating because his black coat was absorbing heat. And I was very aware of heat exhaustion in dogs, because Cassius, one of the tracking dogs, the first tracking dogs in Vietnam, died of heat exhaustion. He actually internally cooked before they could cool him down and get water into him. We followed the enemy, and eventually we reached an area where we could not follow him any further because we no longer had artillery cover. If we had a major contact, we could not call in the guns because we had exceeded range. So we had to turn around and start to head back. And during the heading back, we suddenly realised that we were actually being followed, because another Australian unit not far away had a contact, and they had to retreat. And we were fairly sure that we were being followed as we headed back, and we were a platoon size, about 33 men, and could certainly not deal with it with any major force. We stopped that night, and we got down and collapsed with exhaustion and had to try and dig holes so we had some sort of cover in case we were mortared. And we were out of water and out of food, and things were not looking good. Our mouths weren't dry. I was seeing lights flashing in front of my eyes. I was feeling stomach cramps, and the dog was also panting almost continually. So we called for assistance. We had to have reinforcements and we had to have water delivered quickly. So the command decided that they'd try and get armoured personnel carriers to us, race up along one of the main routes, Route 2, swing off into the bush and work their way towards us so they could get water to us. They had jerry cans on board and all that sort of thing. So we were working our way towards them, and next morning as we woke up, we got hit by the enemy, who had come in that night and had actually planted explosives near us and blew up. So we got up and we hiked again as fast as we could. And everything started to become a blur because without drinking and a lack of water, you really do start to hallucinate things. And we're barely aware of the fact that we're actually moving so quickly, becoming disorientated, and we stopped about a few hundred metres probably from where we thought the APCs were going to meet us. And at that stage, Caesar lay down, his tongue was out and it was red, and his veins along the side of his face were swelling up, and he just crashed over sideways. And I thought, well, I'm losing the dog. With no water left, and guys were waving their hats over him and trying to cool him, but he was still just almost continually just panting at a huge rate of knots. So I picked him up and I carried him as fast as I could through the bush, and we broke out to where the APCs were. And I carried him over and I dropped him down near one of the carriers, and the guys got the jerry cans out and just poured water all over him and tried to cool him at the same time. And he did revive. Other soldiers were picking up jerry cans and guzzling the water down, and the medic was yelling out, don't drink too fast, don't drink. But when you get into that state, all you want to do is get water down your throat. And the dog came through, and that was probably the last operation that I went on before we eventually came home. And that was the one operation that I nearly lost him.
How do you think the armed services saw Caesar? Do you think his life value was as high as another soldier?
Well, the tracking dogs in the army that went to Vietnam were not classified as dogs. They were classified on paper as engineers' stores. So they went along with picks and shovels and front-end loaders and barbed wire. So you had barbed wire, front-end loaders, picks, shovels, hammers, pliers, dogs, and sandbags. That was their classification. They weren't viewed as a dog. Although they did have a number. They were given an army number when they were trained at the Infantry Training Centre. Caesar's number was D6N03. That meant that he was a dog. 6 was the year he was recruited, 1966. N was New South Wales. And 03, he was the third dog recruited into the army. And that was on his dog tag that actually hung on his collar. D6N03, Australian Military Forces. So he had a number and he had a designation, but he was not classified as anything other than a material asset, the same as all the other dogs that were over there. So the military, I don't know whether the military viewed them as a war animal, a war dog. They were just a tracking dog, and they were on the paper as a tracking dog. They didn't have a pay book, as far as I knew. Other dog handlers said that the dogs had ranks, like a corporal and a sergeant and that. I don't think that was the case. They did have a military-type record, but that only originated partway through the war when assessments were being made of the value of tracking teams, tracking dogs, and then their names were used as well. This dog has performed well, but is now not performing well. But we never saw or had access to those records, and they were sealed in the archives up until fairly recently, when a member of our tracking association was able to access them, and we actually found out that assessments were made on the tracking dogs. And I think the assessment was that they worked well in the early years of the war, but when the face of the conflict changed, their usefulness became less apparent.
How did Caesar rate?
I don't know. Usually you only rated the dogs. The handler rated his dog by how the dog performed, and the tracking team and the platoon and the battalion rated that dog on how it performed during that 12 months of duty. But remember that when I left, another handler arrived, and I had to show him how to handle Caesar within a week before I left. And then he took over that dog. He did 12 months of tracking with that dog, and then he left and another person came in. And that was the cycle for all of these dogs. They all had different owner-master handlers for a 12-month period. They were also rotated from battalion to battalion as each battalion sort of left. So they had a very varied sort of war service. And in some battalions that used dogs more than others, they were probably rated better.
The image of the men pouring jerry cans of water over this dog that's not looking in great shape seems to indicate a level of commitment to its life.
Yeah, I think so. They probably would have poured it over a soldier if it collapsed too. But it was apparent that this dog was in poor condition because I was running out holding him in my arms, and he was in a what looked like a lifeless condition. And it was just very lucky that he actually became good. I think after that, in the week or two after that, I thought he was quite more subdued and a lot quieter. It looked like it had a bit of bark chipped off him. But apparently he came good and worked after that in the following year of duty. After that, I wasn't really sure because when I came back from that first tour, myself and another dog handler, we became instructors for other dog handlers and dogs that were being trained to go to Vietnam. And we had no contact. There was no feedback on what was occurring. And we didn't know. It was a typical Army need-to-know basis when we should have been told what was happening, how things were going. And we only got this information from other handlers that came back and said, this worked okay, or that worked all right. But one of the things that I became conscious of in that first tour that I imparted to all of the new handlers was the dangers of mines and booby traps. And I made sure that there was a skew in the training towards becoming aware of mines and booby traps during tracking. And although we never made the dogs mine dogs, I used to set up special booby traps of my own in the bush with smoke grenades and tripwires, and to see whether the dog would actually be walking through it, and to try and make the dog aware of the fact that there was a presence of something there. I went that way, and I was very heavily involved in sort of trying to lift that level of caution about explosives. Other instructors at the training centre dug tunnels and created bunker systems just like the enemy out in the Bulleye forest. So when a handler and a dog and that were actually tracking enemy, they could be walking into an enemy bunker system like the real thing. Because I walked into a couple of bunker systems. I walked into that hole and fell in the hole. And these are things, that I'd learned and brought back and I tried to pass on. So we created real situations back in Australia after we got back where we'd have rice cooking. We'd make rice cook in a pot, and we'd have some veggies around the place, and very, very dirty clothes. And we made sure that the enemy that we were tracking in Australia wore black pajamas or enemy equipment that was similar to enemy equipment, and had smells like that sort of thing. So we try to create that realism in the tracking in the 2 years that I was with the tracking unit as an instructor.
The kind of training that you hadn't been afforded before you left.
Sure, because we went there and we were the first, and we learnt lessons and we survived and came back. So the reasons that we survived was luck and because of the dog, and we wanted to make sure that there was more realism, that we talked about Asians and Viet Cong and NVA, subjects that were never brought up when I was doing training. We would track a couple of diggers running through the bush. Well, now I made sure that we tracked a couple of diggers that were dressed in proper clothing through the bush, and were wearing rubber sandals, not boots, so you could see the track. And occasionally we'd drop clothes off here and there, so the dog would actually pick up the clothing. And those were important things, I thought. And they went on. Those handlers went on overseas. A couple of other dogs went as reinforcement dogs to replace 2 that had stopped working. So the total dogs that went to Vietnam and were 11, and 10 were still there by the time the war had finished.
That dire situation you were talking about where Caesar almost didn't make it with the water, you had to carry dog food as well. Any times when you got so low on rations you were tempted?
No, not really. No, I don't think so. It'd be a brave man that would eat dog food. I never reached the point where I was starving. And you can go for a couple of days without food. You really can. You just cannot do it without water. I never went more than 2 days without food. I mean, it never happened. Maybe some guys in Vietnam did. The thing about dog food was when we were in Nui Dat, not on operations, we would have fresh chopped meat from the kitchen, and we would mix that with chopped up vegetables, and then we'd have typical army biscuits broken over it, and that was the dog's diet. Out in the bush, we carried the cans of tucker box sloppy dog food in large cans, and I spread them around the guys so they all carried a bit. And I had extra packets of biscuits, and at night I would prepare my food in a little cooker. I'd make rice or something, curried rice or something, and I would spoon usually a full can of dog meat into a little square Dixie dish, and then break biscuits over it, and Caesar would eat that very quickly. He was quite happy about eating that food. Marcus was a voracious eater. He was a typical Labrador scavenger, and he would come and steal your own food. So if you put your food down and you were doing something, Marcus would eat that. He was a typical Labrador rat eater. He'd eat anything, and he had a weight problem because of that. So Caesar would actually lope and track very quietly, whereas Marcus's system of tracking was crash through, and he would go like a steam train, and you could hear him coming, woof, 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 and the snorting and sniffing, and he'd exhaust himself quite quickly. So Dennis always had a problem with Marcus of being careful of exhaustion. 2 dogs, 2 different characters, but great friends.
Before we move to the stage at which you left your first tour, I was just wondering on either tour if you'd heard stories of or witnessed it yourself, men hurting other men or lethally wounding other men when there were disagreements and those kind of things.
The situation you're talking about is probably called fragging. Fragging occurs when there's a particularly bitter situation developing between soldiers and probably their leaders, to the point where they'll try to kill him or nearly kill him. A couple of those instances occurred in Vietnam, but I never saw any of them. One occurred in a battalion while I was there, but it wasn't in my battalion, and I never saw it. Occasionally, you'd get a guy who would get absolutely drunk in the boozer one night, and he would go a little bit cuckoo, and he'd walk out, grab his rifle, because you always had your rifle with you, and it always had bullets in it, and cock it and go walking around and swinging it around the place and carrying on about some queer situation or odd situation that affected him. And that happened a couple of times, and he had to be talked down, and it usually took somebody with a fair bit of guts to go up to him and say, listen, stop acting like an idiot and give me a rifle and go and sit down, because they'd be liable for charges for that sort of thing. And I saw that happen a couple of times. And one guy that we were with took a set to intensely disliking the company sergeant major and decided he was going to kill him in his head. And he got drunk and he picked up an M60, loaded the belt on, and he went up looking for the CSM, and he fired off a few rounds but trod on the belt, which jammed the gun. And he was pounced on very quickly, and he was shipped out for psychiatric assessment, never came back. Other than that, I never knew an incident where somebody tried to shoot somebody else. But it happened in Vietnam with the Australians.
Did you see men firsthand break down, just couldn't take it anymore in other ways?
Only on one occasion, and it wasn't a real breakdown, and it occurred in the section that I was commanding on the second tour. A guy's wife had a baby just after he arrived in Vietnam, and the bloke was extremely emotional and overwrought with it, and sat down and broke down and cried, but he got talked through it okay. I never saw anybody, and nobody in the units that I was with actually had nervous or emotional breakdowns because of the war. It was because the men tended to bond together, and it wasn't a case of if I break down, people are going to think I'm weak. Guys would get particularly emotional after they'd been drinking. That's when you usually noticed it. And it just usually end up as an emotional outburst, and he would have some grievance, or that probably one of the worst things that would happen in Vietnam would be the Dear John letter. And like a letter from a girlfriend that says, we're finished, it's through, you know, and the guy's actually in the war. That never happened in any units I was with either. But that was one of the most disturbing situations that occurred. It took a lot of fairly sensitive handling on the part of leaders and commanders to actually overcome that situation. In that same light, one of the worst occasions that occurred with the unit I was with, it was in the 2nd Battalion, and it was 1967, I think. Or maybe it was 68. There was opposition to the war developed in Australia, and the posties in Australia refused to deliver letters that were being posted to or from Vietnam, and that caused an enormous amount of strife, and men were very upset over that, and were quite prepared to come home and assault a postie if they found them for doing that. It lasted for only a short period though. But that was fairly hairy stuff for a while. We weren't getting any mail in or out because of the union ban in Australia. And the soldiers really thought that, you know, that was such an un-Australian thing to do. And it became a big issue.
What effects did you witness?
Well, men basically really pissed off, walking around with loaded rifles. Fortunately in Vietnam, if they were home here, it would have been a bloodbath, I think. A couple of guys who were due, whose time was up in the army, were due to come home, and they were quite prepared to find anybody who was doing it. I wouldn't say all posties did it, but it came down to a postal situation where mail that was going to go to Vietnam was blocked, and mail coming back from Vietnam was blocked at some point by a union action. And soldiers were really prepared to wreak violence over that. That was pretty serious, because there's nothing more disheartening or, you know, that had a greater effect on morale than mail. Because remember, it was the time before cell phones and email and that sort of thing, and guys went there for 12 months. It wasn't like going to more recent conflicts for 6 months with your cell phone and an email. They were going there for 12 months, and their only connection with home life was actually letters. You couldn't use a phone. You couldn't use email. So it was pretty tough. It was like the Second World War as well. I mean, the same thing. You had to have mail. And mail came in delivery on the helicopter with the resupply and rations, bags of mail. And guys would go mad to rip open those bags and get those letters from home.
The end of the first tour comes, you have to leave and go back to Australia. You're leaving Caesar, knowing probably that you're unlikely to see Caesar again. How did you say goodbye?
I went up and I spoke to him in the cage, sitting in his run, and I said, "I'm sorry, I've got to go. you got to stay, that's the way they run the war, don't ever forget me, I won't ever forget you. And then I turned and walked straight away. And he had his bowl in his mouth, and I heard the bowl hit the concrete floor. And I knew that he knew. Because Marcus was watching me as well. Dennis was going to come up afterwards. And I knew they were both watching me as I walked away. And I could actually hear the conversation between them. These bastards are pissing off and leaving us. And it was absolutely traumatising. I went back and I just collapsed and cried in the tent. But that was negated and offset to a certain extent by the euphoria of going. And I knew that the other guy coming in was terrific. He was a good bloke. And I was going back to the tracking dog kennels. So, I got over that fairly quickly. Because I knew the dog was still working. I knew the conditions he'd be under and so on. It was basically a parting of mateship that was wrenching rather than abandonment. The feeling of abandonment of all the dogs came much later on in later years. The fact that they had been just forgotten. Nobody knew. I mean, I was sitting at dinner tables and I was telling the people, say, what did you do in Vietnam? I was a dog handler. We didn't know you had dogs in Vietnam, and I was getting that time and time again. And my work colleagues are saying, what's the story about these dogs? I said, I was a dog handler in Vietnam. Well, tell us what they did. And I told them, I said, gee, you've got to write, that's a great story. Write that book. Oh, that's terrific. And I said, no, and I'm not going to write about that. And then, later on, an incident occurred where I eventually thought, I've got to sit down and I've got to write this dog story. So that people know that these dogs were there and that they were really heroes. They were war heroes.
Would you have been willing to pay for him to come back to Australia?
We all were. All the handlers were prepared to put the money. There was going to be $300 in old money, in that money, to go to New Zealand, be quarantined in New Zealand, and then come home. The army would not allow it. They didn't want it to happen because they wanted the dogs to keep working. And in the end, it was, let's just get out, give these dogs away, make sure they're given to the right people. They're all given to good homes, from what I could find out. All given to good homes. But they should have come home. They just should have come home. There was no reason why they shouldn't.
When you were there on that second tour, and especially towards the end of it, how would you change from the person who first went to Vietnam in '68?
Well, I'd grown up. I went when I was 19 on the first tour. On the second tour, I was 23 going on 24. I don't know whether I had grown up, really. I was more war-wise and probably war-weary, but I was still naive as far as the big picture went of what it was all about. Because when you're actually involved in the war at its coalface, you don't see the big picture. You don't know the means and the motives and why things are happening and why they are. And as far as politics go in Australia at that time, I had no idea what was going on. I knew Gordon was in, Holt was dead, Whitlam was coming, and that sort of thing. So I, like other second tour veterans, my immediate aspect, my basic philosophy after getting to Vietnam then was landing at Luscombe Field and getting out of that plane, and here I am for 12 months. We thought it would be 12 months. All I've got to do is actually survive this. When I got out of the plane when I was 19 on that first tour, it was, oh boy, what awaits us here? This could be a buzz. I don't know. It could be dangerous, but let's find out what happens. And there was an eagerness and enthusiasm and sort of innocence about it. The second time we got out, I thought, I've just got to get through this, and I've got to make sure that the 10 men that I'm in control of, I've got to get through it as well. I've got to get them through it as well. The platoon that I was with on the second tour, there was at least 8 or 9 who were second tourists who had come back a second time, including 2 of the guys that I went through recruit training with in 1966. I found myself with those blokes again, old friends. So we sort of formed a little bit of a nucleus, and our main ambition was to actually get through this war, and we knew exactly what to expect, and to make sure that the national servicemen who were with us and other guys who were with us who were there for the first time were going to get through it as well. But our big problem was the fact that we had leaders, platoon commanders, company commanders and battalion commander who were there for the first time, and they were there. They wanted their bit of glory. They wanted to get a medal because this was the last chance any officer was going to be able to get a medal for courage. And that was something you really had to think about.
How do you know that? Did you hear them talking about that, or there was
Yeah,
some
it's
sort of
just it was basic philosophy of many officers is to win a medal for bravery, and the only way you win a medal for bravery is to actually be in a war, and this war was just about finished. So there's only war that we're going to have. We were conscious of that because of the attitudes displayed by some of them. There was a lot of gung-ho, let's get into it, instead of caution. And eventually we had a huge altercation with our platoon commander, and we mutinied. And he went.
How did that mutiny take place? And who led it?
But basically, we were all in the mess drinking one night, and he came up to say, "Hello, guys, how are you?" Which they often did. We told him what we thought of him. We had no confidence in him, and he was hopeless. We could speak freely because it was our mess. And he broke down and cried and walked out. And he went to the commanding officer the next day and offered to resign his commission because his men no longer had a confidence in him. So the commanding officer posted him out immediately and got us a new platoon commander on the way.
Have you seen him again since that incident?
No, a couple of the others have. I haven't.
Do you still feel that about him?
I do, but after they met him, their attitudes changed. They said, he admitted he felt the way he did. He did some very silly things. And
what in particular?
he used to go to sleep in ambushes with all the clackers for those claymore mines. And the enemy walked through, and we're lying there.
Can you take us through one of those ambushes in particular that stays in
Well, yeah.
but not generally, but specifically. Take us through to a night, that one particular
I believe the result of a medical condition where you can't stay awake, I don't know what it's called. Well, you go and you lay down in the ambush at about 6 o'clock before the sun goes down. All the claymores are placed out. Every man lies in a set position. There's no smoking, no moving, no eating, nothing. You just lie there perfectly still in front of a track. The platoon commander is usually situated in the middle with the platoon sergeant close by. And all the leads from the claymore mines come back to one central point, the platoon commander. And he presses those clackers to detonate them. Now, in an ambush, it's what's called 50%, where men are in pairs. One man goes to sleep, one stays awake. And they alternate every 4 hours or thereabouts in these pairs. So there's always somebody watching that track. The platoon commander and his signaller and his platoon sergeant also share stay awake for certain times. They pass the clackers along to each other. He used to come to him, he used to go to sleep, and as soon as he was supposed to do his shift, he used to go to sleep. Now, the initiation of an ambush is done through the pressing of the claymore mines. Then everything fires at once, but you've got to wait for those claymores to fire. And we had a situation where we were told repeatedly, he's going to sleep. I said, well, we know what's going on, he keeps going to sleep. And then we had enemy walk through. I don't know whether it was 3 or 4 and who they were, but they went along the track. And the claymores weren't detonated. And that did it for us, because that meant that we were waiting and we weren't going to fire until they had blown, and in the meantime these guys could have turned around, seen us and fired at us. So it was that really was the culmination. And I feel, later on in life, one of the stresses that I have, and I've noticed it all the time, is authority. If anybody in authority speaks to me or gives me an order or something like that, I get angry, and I get really angry sometimes. And it's because I equate it with somebody in authority who had the power of life and death over me was incompetent. So now I always make that equation, and that's one of the main stresses that I have today.
Do you ever have trouble with the police or running into other people of authority from that?
Yeah, I do, but generally my relationship with the police has been pretty good because I've been a police reporter, so I've generally dealt with good guys. No, it's like somebody in authority yelling orders at somebody. and I'll suddenly feel I want to kill him. You know, I just really want to kill you. And I sort of take control of myself, but I know how the connection's being made. But after this occurred, the commanding officer of the battalion fronted the three of us 3 section commanders, 3 corporals, and he said, "You've ruined the career of a promising officer. You're going to be officially reprimanded for it," which meant it went on our record. "You ought to be ashamed of yourselves. Now walk out." You know, so we marched out, and all we'd done was we carried this action out to protect the men that we were with.
Had you physically threatened this officer?
No. We just told him he was hopeless, and he broke down.
Were there any times where you did detonate the mines on those ambushes and kill Viet Cong?
No, no, I don't. It didn't occur.
What was the worst contact you were in that second tour?
Actually, we didn't have a worse contact. There was no full-on firefights concerning the unit that I was with. We got hit by friendly fire, which was basically a couple of mortar shells came down short, and they fell short and exploded amongst us with bits of shrapnel. You know, some guys got bits of shrapnel in them, and that was just a stupid mistake, but it didn't cost anybody their lives. It could have cost us our lives. I mean, to be killed by friendly fire in your second tour would have been a horrific event. It was basically a slog and grind down of 9 months. Searching, patrolling, searching. Every now and then a really savage incident would occur to the battalion involving a contact. Helicopters got shot down, and you know, those sort of things.
You did see a helicopter in a tree, I think you described.
Yeah, that was immediately after a big contact at an operation called Overlord, where one of the companies in the battalion, the 3rd Battalion, ran into a huge bunker system, attacked a huge bunker system, and it was a full-on fight that went on nearly all day. And it was during that time that a resupply helicopter came to try and drop ammunition, and it got shot at, and it came down through the trees and exploded and burned. And a few hours later, or towards that afternoon or early evening, we were asked to go up into this contact position and actually secure it. And we went up, and it was hanging in the trees. Saw it actually in the trees. It was burnt out shell.
Bodies of the crew? Where were the bodies of the crew?
They'd been removed. Yeah, they'd been flown out. That I think it was actually that looking at that particular wastage and realising that, you know, why were you doing this now? Why don't we just finish and get out? That may have impacted later on.
Why? You weren't winning. I mean, you know, you're at the coalface and you didn't realise the bigger picture, but were you not even achieving the coalface objectives? Or the coalface objectives didn't mean anything to you at the time then? Well,
the political decision had been made that the South Vietnamese army would take over the responsibility of all the Allied forces that were the American and Australian. It was called the Vietnamisation program, and that was up and running. So we were gradually going to be replaced and pulled back, and the South Vietnamese army would take the full combat role that we were doing. So everything was a matter of time and deadlines.
So when did you become aware that you were? It wasn't just you that were going home, but the entire.
The American. It was a phased down withdrawal, where no new units were placed into Vietnam, and the numbers were not increased. And the Australians had 3 battalions there. One battalion, when the next battalion went home, it was not replaced, leaving 2 battalions there. Those 2 battalions, that's about 1,600 men, had to do the job of 3 battalions. That was what I was talking about, this beginning of the shortage of resources. And new equipment wasn't replaced and those sort of things. And there was just the 2 battalions left there, which were soon going to become 1 until there was a total phase out. So, and the intensity of the enemy activity had not lessened, but the slack was taken up just now by 2 battalions instead of 3.
How long before you actually flew out were you given word that you would be leaving, you personally?
Well, it came down through the jungle vine. If this is how it's going to happen, you'll all be gone on July So the 3rd Battalion would be gone in July or whatever it was.
Did you become extra cautious during this period when you were new?
Became extra cautious as soon as we became aware that there was going to be a rollback. That was when, I mean, we were cautious anyway. We were really on it anyway. We thought we were going to do 12 and we were very cautious then. When it was announced that we were coming out and patrols would continue, we just got extra cautious. Cautious isn't the word for it, really. It was more extremely nervous. It's called the short timer syndrome. The short timer syndrome means that you've suddenly passed a date where you're on a clock that's ticking, and you know that on the 13th of January you're going to be gone, and you're only 4 weeks from it. So you're used to, like in Vietnam, you're always counting backwards how many days you've got left. Not how many days you've been there, always how many days you've got left. So you had 14 or 15 days left. That was really short syndrome, and you'd do anything to avoid going into bushwork or doing anything hazardous or volunteering for anything. So we were all on that, but particularly the second tours.
How did you count the days off? How did you personally count?
Oh,
the days
we had calendars hanging on the fence. Yeah, it was a nude with months all over her body, and each one was crossed off. Yeah, that was the way it was done. Some had other ways of doing it, but that was the usual one. I mean, nobody really was more aware of the passing of time and the minutes and hours and days and the rest of it. And as a soldier who becomes a short timer, like it's 15 minutes to dinner, and it's 4 3/4 hours to breakfast, and it's 2 hours and 15 minutes to lunch. And it's 3 hours to stand to, 20 minutes to stand to, and then it'll be 7.5 hours to breakfast. And it's like the machinations of time just become, they're studied almost, right down till you're ready to go. So that we knew we were going on a date and a time, and we knew that we were coming out of the bush and there'd be no more operational duties a fortnight before we flew out. So we knew that that was actually the red line. Once you got over past operational duties, you no longer went out in the bush, you were pretty safe. You were then going to be knew out for 2 weeks, and at the end of that 2 weeks, you were going to fly out in a Chinook to the aircraft carrier, and all you had to do was get that flight and make sure that it got on the aircraft carrier. So that was the acuteness of time, and that was the situation that we were in the 8th month. Yeah.
Did you lose when you were over there? Were there any colleagues that that you knew quite well that were badly wounded or killed when you were there?
No, not on the second tour.
On the first tour?
Yeah, I had a good friend killed. He was a dog handler, and he got killed in a shooting accident. He was one of the guys that actually went to the fire support base Anderson to replace me with his dog,
What happened?
Julian.
What happened to
And he
him?
got killed in a shooting accident.
What sort of shooting?
Well, I can't go into the details on that.
Is there any particular reason? Or you?
Well,
family reasons. Or?
Well, family reasons mainly.
Yeah. Can you just stop for a sec, sorry? Peter, can you take us through your departure from Vietnam, second tour, and
The departure from Vietnam was basically walking out, getting onto a Chinook helicopter, landing on the deck of the aircraft carrier, and I had the Navy guy that I told you about earlier that I went into the services with, Kevin, was waiting on the deck. He was in the Navy and hadn't seen him for a couple of years. Hello, so it was quite a celebration meeting him. And I thought that I'd spend the next 14 days, I think it was, where we'd actually get on the grog and talk about old times. And I just got off and I was shaking hands with him, and I got collared by a naval officer who said, "You're a corporal, are you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I'm putting you in charge of mess duties and for the period of the tour home." So for the 14 days that I was on the ship coming home, I had to supervise people in the mess, so I worked the whole way home. And yeah, that was the coming home for me. Yeah.
before you left though, during that second tour, had you made any attempt to look for Caesar or?
I made inquiries. Basically, there were a few guys who had been left behind with a battalion that were replaced. They were called a late party or after party. They're the guys that were the last blokes left, and they flew home in a jet. So in fact, they got home before the ship. And I asked them about the dogs that had been there and whether Caesar had been there. And I was told that Caesar had been there, and he had been flown up to Saigon and given to the British Embassy. That was a certainty. There was no mistake about it. So I tried to find some way that I could get an administrative visit to Saigon, but it never worked out. So I just let it go, and I had my hands full anyway. And I just put it all behind me. I didn't think about it anymore.
Is that a conscious effort? You had to do that? Or?
No. It was quite easy to do because I had my hands full. And I was concentrating on basically staying alive in this country, getting out of here. And I did not want to think about dogs and the sentimentality of dogs and old mates and the rest of it. That was one of the furthest things from my mind. You know, the dislocation with the dog had occurred years before. And it wasn't going to come back until a lot later in civilian life, you know, when I started to get sentimental about it. So it wasn't even there. It wasn't on the agenda at all. Trying to make a real effort to try and get up and see him, because I believed he was all right. When I was given that information, I believed it was okay.
Can you take us landing back in the Australia you found? Was it the same place you'd left? Had you changed or Australia had changed?
Both. Oh, yeah, certainly. 1971, the war protest had been up and running full kick. The war was basically over. Everybody wanted out of it. Everybody was making a conscious effort not to think about it anymore, and this collective amnesia was going to set in. It was basically what was going to happen. So myself and all the others basically that came back, that were in reasonably good shape, physically and mentally, really were in reasonably good shape. Got our war service loans, bought our houses, and stepped out into a sort of a new life. So I took my discharge in January the 6th, 1972, at Keswick, where I'd walked in 1966. I had no job. I had no prospects of any job, but you didn't have to worry about those things in those days because there was plenty of work around. I walked straight across the road to Clark Rubber Stores and I asked for a job. And the guy who ran it, Malcolm Clark, he was fairly sympathetic to servicemen and that. And he said, "Well, sure, you can come and work for us. What can you do?" I said, "Nothing really. You know, I was trained. I could shoot. I could blow things up. I knew a fair bit about dogs. I did make an attempt later on to get into the police force, which was setting up a dog unit. I knew that was coming. I went and made an inquiry, and I was told I couldn't do it because I had glasses. I'd been fitted by glasses at the stage, which is rubbish. But anyway, Malcolm Clark gave me a job in his warehouse driving a forklift truck, and I damaged about $1,000 worth of his swimming pools, so he gave me a job as a store manager. And I stayed in working for Clark for around about 18 months, I think. I got married, and kids had come along, and I'd gone through various other jobs, and I always figured that I'd wanted to be a journalist, and as to how I could actually get into journalism.
Before that, there were active protests against the war, and when you got home, how did you feel about, at that time in 71, the protesters that were on the streets and the moratoriums that had gone on earlier? And
I think they had. I think that actually finished.
Yeah, it was much earlier, the moratorium.
Well, the moratorium occurred here in Adelaide several weeks or a month before I came down to Adelaide to join 3RAR. So that was actually that would have been 1970. And it was pretty well all over. The hangover of Vietnam was basically a hangover. And this, let's forget it all, get it out of the way.
How were you treated by civilians when you told them you were a Vietnam veteran?
Indifference. The overriding attitude early on was indifference. So you're right. Okay, what else are we talking about? But then the passage of time, and it was a fair time. I think it was 1986, 87, when the Welcome Home Parade was held in Sydney, and that was 14 years after I'd come back. That was a major watershed turning point.
Before that time, the immediate sort of transition to civilian life in peacetime, what are the manifestations of being at war, if you like, in your mind?
No, I don't know. This is what I spoke to you about earlier. This PTSD thing comes out much, much later. If you actually bury it, if it's put down and buried back into the subconscious, it can stay there for a certain amount of time, and then it will become apparent. And it's usually quite a few years before it eventually busts out. During the period of 1972 through till about 1982, or a little bit later, I didn't have any apparent problems. But then things started to become apparent, and I felt these, what are now called stresses, certain things that are touched that actually trigger things off. But up until that time, I lived a basic ordinary civilian type life, and my war service was behind me. And there was no reason to think about it. And when that Welcome Home Parade came up, basically I knew a lot of other guys were in trouble. I knew that. Some of them were in serious trouble and committed suicide, the whole thing. The whole shed collapsed with a lot of men. But I was not going to be part of that. That was not on my agenda, and I was not going to submit to it, and I was not going to suffer PTSD or any of those sort of things. I had a few skin complaints, and that was basically the only problems I had, I thought. So I stayed right away from other veterans stayed away from me. I kept contact with a couple of guys who were friends anyway, including the bloke from the Navy. The other situation was coming home from Vietnam. If you were a member of certain battalions, you were actually splintered up around Australia. So guys who were from Western Australia joined battalions in Queensland. And when they came back, they went back to Western Australia. So they lost immediate contact with those men who were part of that battalion. We came from all over the place. And the 2nd Battalion, which was my first unit, that was Brisbane-based. And I was in Adelaide. So there was only about 3 or 4 guys here in South Australia who were members of that unit. This fragmentation caused by national service led to a denial of the networking that the Second World War men had. And that denying of the networking means that, you didn't have any communication, there was no barbecues, and you didn't hang around with other guys and that sort of thing. So you actually were quite often in isolation.
Was there some, even, there's amnesia in Australia about the war, was there some sort of sense that you didn't want to talk about it either, or remember your service over there?
Well, nobody wanted to hear about it. It was a piece of history that had gone on for 10 years that was awful. And it was best to have it out of the way and forgotten. Good, okay, fine. But you had 58,000 men and women involved. And you couldn't just, you can't destroy and blank out a piece of history that lasts for 10 years involving 58,000 Australians. 520 of them were dead. 2,500 to 3,000 have been wounded. And you can't just, right, that's it, get that out of the way, forget it. It couldn't happen. But we thought that it could. We thought it could. And the generation of protesters was still there, but they were getting older. We were all getting older. And then another generation came along, like the next one up from or behind the protesters, younger, who didn't really know much about the war. They were growing up, and then another generation was coming up. And that was when things started to change. Plus the rise in nationalism. And the big turning point, as well as the Welcome Home Parade, was 1995, Australia Remembers. That was a colossally successful exercise in schools, and focused on veterans, not Vietnam veterans, Korean veterans, World War II, but just veterans. And now I'm not a Vietnam veteran, I'm a veteran. And nobody's aware of the political problems that were associated with that war. All they are concerned about is he's a veteran, and he's Australian, and he's a veteran. So now I'm a celebrity. No, it's taken 35 years.
At the time, though, you must have known after the pullout, and the province did fall rapidly back to the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Phuoc Tuy.
Well, it was a loss.
How did you feel about that?
It was. I'm sorry. You know, it wasn't. We did everything that we had to do. We did the job we had to do. We did not lose the war. Politicians lost that war, and it was a lost cause. It was a lost cause, well and truly, after 1968. And now, all those people who were in South Vietnam who wanted that freedom were now completely overrun, and we ended up with loads of boat refugees coming here, and we should welcome them in here because we were supposed to have saved them in the first place. There was a great feeling of guilt on the part of many veterans, and I felt guilty myself, but I realised after a while there's nothing I could do about this. It's like all wars decided with politics, economics, and public opinion.
Now, what are the flashbacks you get now? What are the sort of the symptoms of the PTSD?
The guy who went to sleep with the clackers, sees her falling over, sees her going through the helicopter and straight out the other door, me falling on my ass, having a drink in the mess, and going down that winch in the rain.
Yeah. Sorry, do you still have dreams? Those dreams come back to you? Or
No,
they...
no. I never had problems with dreams and nightmares. I never wake up sweating and shouting. I never had any of that. A lot of guys did, but I didn't. My basic problems were day-to-day sort of dealing with flashes of anger and so on that may come up. PTSD is a very strange thing. You can tell yourself, look, I can get a handle on this and I'll avoid situations that send me off. But you can't. You really can't. It suddenly comes, and I'm a very, very mild case. Very mild case. Some are extremely severe, where guys actually go into a complete zone and they just sit looking at you, and they'll act somewhere else. And other situations where they'll become violent. And this was exacerbated by alcohol. I really hit it. When I came back, I really hit the grog. And up to the age of 40, I was drinking colossal amount, and I was getting through a bottle of port before breakfast. No problem. And as with all grog, you lose your mind eventually. That was making me worse, and that actually led to the disintegration of my marriage. Was booze. And I went eventually to AA. I had a very good friend living next door who was a doctor. He used to drink with me. And one day he said, "You really drink a lot. You better come and see me." And I went and saw him. He said, "If you don't stop within a few months, you'll probably be dead." I said, "Oh, what's the problem?" He says, "Oh, well, you'll go mad or your liver will probably break down." And coming from him, it was sobering because he was a real drinker. So I went to AA. And that was one of the great life-saving moves, 12 steps of AA. And I was doing at least one meeting a night. I try and do 3 or 4 a week. And it got me off it. I just stopped drinking. And I sort of got my life back, really. I mean, that the sort of spiralling madness that's equated with continually boozing got my life back. And I met Denise and we got married. Yeah, so I got on well with my kids. They never asked about my war service. They were quite young. I wrote the book Trackers. They both read it, so they read about it. They thought it was great. My war service to them is no really big deal. They see their dad as a Vietnam veteran in today's context of things, as with all veterans. So that worked out okay. I was really grateful about that because I thought that the kids would suffer, possibly from some sort of birth defect, which I'd been warned about, from the Agent Orange thing. They weren't, and they went through a divorce, but they came through it okay. Their mum and dad talked to each other, so that's basically all right as far as they're concerned. Plus, they're grown up now. But Vietnam veterans' kids, I know, are having real problems. A lot of them are having real problems That's a fact. The studies have shown that. And the DVO is directing funds towards that because it's suddenly become extremely alarming.
Yeah, wars don't end at the...
No,
the
no, no.
hostilities, do they?
The legacy just goes on. Legacy of all wars goes on. Yeah, the fallout.
Looking back on that war now, all this having... time has passed. How do you feel about, broadly, the Vietnam War?
When I actually started writing the books, I wrote the first one, I wanted a second, we did a third, and then I got on the fourth. I find it stimulating to write about it and to write about the men that are in the action and how men performed under extreme circumstances and how they bonded together as soldiers and so on. It's when I write about those that have died that I didn't know but know of that I feel this incredible burden of sadness and this incredible wastage of that young bloke's life. And I think of those that he left behind, the parents that were left behind and had to suffer in anguish over all this, this loss of a son in that war. And I'm just so sad that it happened because it took the lives of all those young Australians. But the important thing is that they're not forgotten. They will not be forgotten, and they will not be blamed for that war. They were actually Australian diggers doing their jobs, servicemen doing their jobs, and they went there with all the best intentions. They band together. They held the Australian tradition, whether it was a bad war or a good war. And people used to say, "You were in that unpopular war." I often say to them, "Can you give me a popular war?" The stupidity of some people that still equate Vietnam with being a bad war. There is no good wars. Can't be. A just war and an unjust war? Well, I don't know. It was just because it was started out with the intent. The Australian intention was that South was going to be taken over from the North. 20 to 30 years on, we've seen all the shenanigans, all the political manipulations that were involved, and how the CIA got, and how it was a political war and the grab for power and all that sort of thing. Puppet regimes here and puppet regimes there. Does
that make you resentful to certain...
incredibly distrustful towards a government and its commitments. Very. So I tell young Australians, question every decision that's made regarding conflicts. Yeah.
One last question. It's a pretty open one, and it's up to you whether you respond to it. But this will be 50 or 100 years' time. Someone's going to look at this tape and any particular message you might have for those future generations or future people who may, based on your experience?
I think the Vietnam War, like all the wars that we were involved in, reflected Australia's character. Yeah. I think it showed all the good things about Australians under extraordinary conditions. And you'll see it in bushfires and floods and the rest of it. The good of Australians comes out. And I think that'll come out. And also, if we have to get involved in another conflict, I think it's up to Australians to question. And there's one thing, you've got to have a guarantee that you'll look after the veterans after the war. Yeah.
Good positive thing to finish on. Thanks very much for telling us, Peter.
Pleasure.
It's a real great thing.
Well, that was good. It was
okay.
Good. Yep.
Good on you.